Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us this evening to discuss a very important topic, which is healthy buildings with our speakers. My name is Tida Gossen. I'm the Sustainability Chair of ASHRAE Brasil Chapter, and I will be chairing this event this evening. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So tonight we will be discussing healthy buildings, people, performance, and design in a post-COVID world. Speakers will be discussing and covering emerging trends when it comes to health and well-being of buildings and its occupants, along with strategies and interventions driven by a post-COVID world. So I believe you can also see the subtitles, right?
Yes.
I'm not sure, but I'm not moving on with my slides. Okay. So I want to start thanking our sponsors, which help us develop all activities here in our chapter. So our platinum sponsors, Bree, Johnson's Control Itachi, Midea Carrier, Train, Schneider. Our gold sponsors, Daikin, Airside, Comfort Lab, Vertiv, EcoQuest, Munters, Sigflux, and Trox. And our silver sponsors, Mercato and Industrialas. I also want to thank our supporters, Abrafaki, Abrava, Abrinstal, Asbrave, Amprac, Aureside, Ibiza Brazil and GBC Brazil, and ASHRAE Region 5, which comprises chapters from the US, such as Michigan and Ohio, and also our partner, ASHRAE Brasil Chapter. So we're going to start with a presentation of our chapter, a brief institutional presentation, but I just want to invite our president, Juliana Pellegrini, to give us a few words. Juliana, are you here?
Yes, I'm here, Cida. Thank you so much. Sorry, I have a problem with my connection, so I don't think you're able. I need to get in my cell phone. I don't think you're able to see me, but sorry for all. But it's a pleasure to be here. Good evening. I would like to welcome everyone and thank you for attending our ASHRAE Brasil Chapter event today. In particular, our speakers, Erin McConaughey, Christina Candido, Jack Nolan, and Jean Ollison. Jean, thank you for accepting our invitation once again. I remember the last time we were able to meet in person during our visit to our country, and I hope in the more opportune moment to be able to see you and welcome you both here to Brazil. It will be a pleasure. We are very happy to be able to host this event. We have been planning it for the past years, and I would like to thank Cida, who led the organization too. Talking about this subject is in this current moment we are living in a period we are returning to activities in a post-pandemic world, and right after the COP26, I think is extremely relevant time. ASHRAE Brasil Chapter has been working to disseminate knowledge of these topics to professionals who works in the construction and operation of the built environment here in Brazil. We are trying to follow the guidance to our society. So it's really a pleasure to be able to organize this kind of event. And thank you once again to you all, to your presence, and have a great event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliana, for joining us. So I'm just going to give you all an indication of timing. So this is our schedule. We had like a few words from our president, Juliana Pellegrini, and now I'm going to give you a brief presentation of our ASHRAE institution. And then we're going to start with the lectures, which is divided in two sessions, session 1 and session 2. Each session has, by the end of each session, we have a Q&A session, question and answers. So to all our audience, please do post any question you might have in the Q&A session. It's on the window on your right side of the screen. Questions are really important so we can better engage in this discussion. So moving forward, I'm just going to give you a brief presentation of our chapter. So ASHRAE was founded in 1894, and it is a global society with a mission of serving humanity and advancing the science of heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and refrigeration. Our vision is to build a healthy and sustainable built environment for all by developing standards, research, and publications across the globe. Our core values are based on commitment, integrity, excellence, voluntarism, diversity, and collaboration. So ASHRAE is celebrating 125 years in 2020, and we have more than 57,000 volunteer members across the world and in more than 130 countries. We have more than 190 chapters with more than 400 student branches, and we have about 7,400 student members. Our members profile go across engineers, designers, consultants, architects, installers, manufacturers, and students. So what we do, what ASHRAE usually does, is to develop technical standards and guides to improve the built environment. We serve as a source of technical information for members, chapters, companies, and government. We offer continuing education for industry professionals. We serve as a networking tool for industry professionals as well. And how we do it? We have more than 33 permanent and technical committees to develop standards, guides, and many other publications. We have now more than 300 publications done by ASHRAE. We also offer scholarships for students. We have certification programs for professionals and for buildings, and we have more than 200 educational courses online. So in 2019, ASHRAE has developed its strategic plan, which is based in two main goals. First is to build a resilient buildings and communities, and also the second goal is to better develop indoor environmental quality. So this event is based on these two main goals, specifically on indoor environmental quality. So here is just a view of our main standards, like ASHRAE standard 62.1, which is about ventilation, 90.1, which is about energy. So if you are a member and if you work with HVAC systems, you are familiar with all these standards. Talking a bit about our chapter. So Chapter Brazil was founded in 2002, and in 2018 we have divided it into chapters in our country, ASHRAE South Brazil and ASHRAE Brasil Chapter. We have more than 400 members, and we also have about 15 student branches across these two chapters. Each student branch is linked to a university, and we also have a student branch in Guatemala. So this is just a view of a view on our board of directors. So Juliana Pellegrini, who has talked to us now, our president. We have Walter Lazy, which is our president-elect, Adenilson Belisário, our vice president, Alexandre Contoyanes as our treasurer, and Daniela Marchesi as our secretary. So unfortunately, we are missing pictures, but I just want to give you a view of our team. So this is our committee chairs, and this is our board of governors and auditing. And I want to give a big thank for all our team for helping us putting together all activities within the chapter. So this is just to give you a brief view of our activities. We have been doing many events throughout this year, and we are now in November, so we still have events going on in December and in next semester. So please join us in our events. It's on our website. So if you're not a member yet, please consider joining us so you would have access to technical publications, courses, and events discounts, and a huge and strong networking platform. As a member, you also have access to the ASHRAE Journal and the High Performance Building magazine. If you are a young engineer, if you recently graduated, and you are a student, please get involved in all activities being developed with us. So you can find us on all social medias and our website and our email. So if you have questions, please get in touch. So let's get started. Let's get started with session 1 with Professor Bjarne Olsen and Erin. I want to start giving a brief background of Professor Bjarne Olsen from Technical University of Denmark. He's going to talk to us about the influence of occupant behavior on indoor environment and energy use in buildings. Professor Olsen has 14 years experience from university and industry in research on the impact of indoor environment on people and energy performance of building and HVAC systems. He has obtained several ASHRAE awards like Hoff Nevins Awards, Distinguished Service Award, Fellow Award, Exceptional Service Award, Andrew T. Bog Service Award, and Donald Benflint Environmental Health Award. Whoa. Was in 2012 knighted by the Danish Queen. He is active in several standards committees regarding indoor environment and energy performance of HVAC systems. He has published more than 400 papers. Please welcome Professor Bjarne.
Thank you. So
I'm making you a presenter.
Right.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay. Then I'll start my presentation. I'll just put it in presentation mode. So, I don't know. Yes, thank you, and good afternoon or early evening in Brazil. I'm today giving a talk on the influence of occupant behavior on energy, environment, and energy use in buildings. And why it's important is that the reason we make buildings and that we heat and cool and ventilate buildings is, of course, for the occupants. So it's important to know how the occupant behave. Sometimes they may do things that deteriorate the indoor environment, use a lot of more energy, but other times they will behave so we can save energy. The part of the talk here, I will explain the importance of the occupant behavior. I'll give some examples on the influence it can have on energy and indoor environment. And also especially how can we take into account occupant behavior when we do building simulations? today we are using a lot of building simulations to predict the energy use and the indoor environment in building. And also I'll talk a little about what is it that drive occupant behavior. Why is it they do things? So when we talk about indoor environmental quality, there are many people who has an influence on this environment. First of all, it's data we know from building research. What do we know? What can help us in the design? What do we know about occupant comfort and health research? What guidelines and criteria do we have to set? So the building designers, HVAC and art designers, they have some values, criteria for the indoor environment to design for, and also to base the energy calculations. But that's all on the just paperwork. Very important is, of course, also the construction, the component that is being used. So the manufacturing, installation, and commissioning is very important. But when the building then is in operation, we also have the occupants in the building. So besides the building owner or the facility management, we have the occupants which they go and may change the settings of the thermostats. They also may go and change the blinds. So they influences the energy use, but they also influences the indoor environment, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. We know from literature, from several studies, both field studies, but also laboratory studies, that the occupant behavior can affect the energy use by more than 300%. So we have seen from identical dwellings that the highest energy user is typically 2 to 3 times higher than the lowest. Here are some data from more than 290 identical housing. It's from Denmark, so we are mainly talking about heating. So it's only for heating I'm talking about now. And we should see here on the graphic at the bottom that there is a huge distribution of the energy use in kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And here the number of housing. So we have some who are using very little, and some who are using 20 times as much as the lowest. And it's about the same type of families. It's the same type of houses, but that's the variations you really can get in the energy use. And a lot of that you can relate to how people are using their buildings. Here are some other data from apartment building in China. And here, if you look at the apartment numbers, and on the graphic, you again have the kilowatt hours per square meter per year use of electricity. That is both heating and cooling. And you see again a huge difference from the very low users to those who are using a lot. Here's another example where we can see there are some discrepancy between what we predict building will use and what they really use. So here we have for more than 135,000 Danish houses, we did calculation of the predictive use for their energy certificates. We have to do that for all new buildings. They need to get an energy certificate. And that's what we calculated. Depending on A, you have a very low energy use. So that's normally a newly constructed building with very good insulation and triple pane windows. And G is a very high level of energy use. If you now look at what did those buildings use, so this is for measurement of the actual use, and you see here that for low energy buildings, we are down here at A and B, we predict that they are using much less than they actually are using. But if we look at the building with the high energy use, in fact, they are lowering less than we predicted. We had at the beginning a little difficult to explain that. And it may be difficult from you from Brazil to understand, because in Denmark, it's mainly the heating. It's still mainly the heating. And many people, they have their own like fireplace or closed fireplace where they can do wood burning. And a lot of people, especially in the old houses, which are not well insulated, they use this fireplace a lot. So the energy use is much smaller than we predicted. But for new buildings, and that's where we are now, it seems like we are predicting a lower energy use than we in fact get. So we are on the way to develop towards new near zero energy buildings. But if you're using traditional technologies like higher insulation, better windows, heat recovery, building airtight, we need also to look at the HVAC system, for example, demand control ventilation, not ventilate more than needed, solar shading to control overheating, and daylight to reduce the cooling needs, control of lighting, and also possible times of the year where it makes sense to open windows. So if you look now at what can the user influence, those on top we can call robust technologies, because people, the occupant, there's really no user interactions. So it works without people in the building. But if you go below for the systems, where the user can interact, they can change the setting, they can change the shading, and they can change the control. So they are very sensitive to occupant behavior. We know from studies and literature that this behavior has an impact both on indoor environment and energy. And if a change occurs in a building that produces discomfort, people, they will react in a way so they try to get back to comfort again. So one thing is you can adjust to the environment. That means you can change your clothing if it's getting too warm. You may be able to lower your activity level. You may lower your posture. You could also have hot and cold drinks, but that doesn't really help that much. But you can also adjust the environment by changing thermostat settings, maybe open windows, change of light and the shading. But then you also have activities which are not aiming at adjusting the environment, but putting a load on the environment, like cooking, electrical load from electrical appliances, and humidity generation from showering. So these, how people behave here, also influences the energy use and the indoor environment. And when we talk about people, there's very much different in what people prefer and also how sensitive they are. There are some people who are very sensitive, like for example, the princess on the P from, you may know it from the fairy tale of Hans Christian Andersen. She can feel a P which are below 10 mattresses. And if people are so sensitive, for example, they would require to have an acceptable air quality 20 times as much fresh air. So it's impossible to do something so everybody is satisfied, because we are individual different. So the occupant, they have to try to sometimes modify, for example, their clothing so they all can feel comfortable. And there are ways we can say how much adjust of clothing, how much impact that will have on the felt temperature. So for example, if you put on take off a thin sweater, would be the same comfort feeling as reducing the room temperature 1.3 degrees. So we have some possibilities to satisfied by individual adaptation. Occupant behavior has, during the last 10-20 years, been focused on many research activity. The International Energy Agency have different annexes that are working with different topics. And we have had now 2 annexes working with occupant behavior. And we started a year or 2 ago a new annex, occupant behavior-centric building design and operation. And they will generate a lot of more knowledge. ASHRAE has also put some focus on occupant behavior. We have started, it's not a TC, but it's something like the beginning of a TC. It's a multiple task group, which are working with members from different TCs on the issue of occupant behavior. And recently, we had an ASHRAE research project, which were establishing a database with data from studies on occupant behavior in buildings. And this database can now be used by researchers to make new models or verify their existing models. I'll give you a couple of examples of occupant behavior and the impact. Here's a case where we were out measuring energy use and indoor environment in 39 apartment buildings, where they paid according to how many square meter the apartment was. So there was a total energy use for the whole building, and then it was divided by the number of square meters. Then we had another apartment building with 17 apartments, where each apartment had an energy recording. So they measured the energy for each individual apartment. And that influenced how people, they used their building. So if we look at the broken lines, so this is a proportion of the period where people have a temperature above a certain temperature. So the broken lines here, these are all from the building where people, they had the individual meters. The average for those people are here, compared to those who were paying by the square meters. And you see here, people who paid by the square meter, they kept a more comfortable temperature than the others. The others really tried to save energy by keeping a very low temperature in their homes, which may not be very comfortable and may risk also condensation and mold growth if you keep the temperature too low. And we saw the same also with humidity, because when we now go to look at the ventilation, shown by the CO2 concentration, a higher CO2 concentration means you are ventilated less. And again, we saw that those who were paying by individual metering, they were not ventilating so much as the people who were paying per square meter. So this influenced how people behave. If you look at what you check, I mean, many people, they check the email each hour, their Facebook account, their bank account, maybe once a week. But the energy meter, very few people are looking every month on how much energy they're using. Maybe once a year when they get the bill for the energy. So people have no feeling about their actions and how it relates to the energy. So feedback to people about their actions is also important. And I see we will see more of that when we go into digitalization. We will have more sensors where we can get feedback to people on their occupant behavior. We had another study where we were looking at feedback also, where we measured the indoor environment, temperature, relative humidity, and CO2 concentration to relate to how much you ventilate. And then they got monthly feedback on their energy use, but also on the indoor environment. So each apartment had sensors. We could also record the window openings and when they changed the heating set point. And together with the outdoor environment and indoor environment, we got data so we could try to predict window openings from, for example, outside temperature or indoor temperature or CO2 concentration. So we wanted to get some data for doing simulation of occupant behavior. We also gave some feedback. This was very simple feedback using smileys or icon telling about how they had been doing regarding energy use, how they had been doing regarding the indoor environment. So they got a feeling for, could relate some of their actions in the house to the energy use. And we could, in this way, we could persuade them to, for example, again in the heating period, to run with a little lower temperature in the living room. We had a reference group. In the same time, we didn't get feedback. And they did change the temperature in the living room a little, but not as much as those getting feedback. And the same was related to ventilation. So feedback to people can help them behave better, so they get a better indoor environment, but also often they don't waste so much energy. Let me give a couple of examples from schools. We are looking a lot of schools because often the schools, indoor environment in schools is not very good in many countries, also in Denmark. And many schools in Denmark, they are depending on, the ventilation is depending on, for example, window opening. So if you're now here on the left, you have the percentage of window open in a classroom. This is data from many classrooms. And the green one is the CO2 concentration when they get feedback on when to open window. And the blue one is the CO2 concentration when we don't give them any feedback on when to open windows. And on the right-hand side, you can see the CO2 level. If you don't give them any feedback, they keep the windows closed. In Denmark, it's cool outside during winter, so they don't want to open the windows because they know it will be drafty and they can feel the cool air. So that results in very high CO2 concentration. But if they get the feedback that the air quality is bad, then you get lower CO2 concentration. If you now look in summertime, and we have without any cooling, so we don't have any active cooling in the classrooms. But you see in summertime, they are opening the windows a lot. And it doesn't really matter to give them feedback or not. They are very good at opening windows. But the reason they open the windows is not because of bad air quality. It's because the temperatures are getting high. And with a little lower outside temperature, they feel they can cool the classroom down by opening windows and doors. So it's again, it's not the air quality that make them do the right thing and get more ventilation. It's a temperature. So if you now give those people cooling in the classroom during summer, then we see here the green, they don't open the windows anymore. No, the green is when they get feedback. When they don't get feedback, they don't open the windows anymore. But with the feedback, again, they open window. So these are some of the things where, for example, the feedback to the teachers and so is very important. So we looked at different ventilation system types in buildings. We had manual operable windows, automatic controlled opening of windows, maybe combined with exhaust, or we had a balanced ventilation system. And you see the ventilation rate, so which are really the indoor air quality. In the non-heating season, they had more ventilation. That is, in the summertime, they had more ventilation. That's a black in all types of ventilation system. Here is manual operable windows, automatic opening of windows according to a CO2 sensor, automatic open of windows combined with an exhaust fan, you get more ventilation, and mechanical balance ventilation. So that's, you see, the mechanical balance ventilation more or less guarantee you a right level of ventilation. There's many factors that can influence what people are doing. So window opening drivers, that of course could be the things that you're feeling too warm, and you know, and it's summertime. The heating set point depends on the temperature and so on. And also window and blinds may be influenced if you want to look out. Is it a nice environment you have? You want more daylight? So many things can influence how people behave. And what we would like to do is we would like to model human behaviors. We want to know more about what are the drivers. And that's why we need data. And that's why important our data at ASHRAE had established this database. So here's a prediction. What is the probability that you will open window based on the outdoor temperature? These are different predictions. And you can now build these predictions into a computer simulation. I'll just skip this one here. So to establish different models on, for example, here window openings and set points depending on outdoor temperature now, we need data so we can make these relation. And there has been a lack of data, but we are seeing now from the different activities also in the annexes I talked about, we are getting more data. So today, when you simulate a building and you simulate the occupant, it's often based on that you decide how your occupant behave. For example, you say, when the temperature indoor get about 25, you start the air conditioning or you open windows. When it get below 21, you close air conditioning. Air quality, normally you have a constant ventilation rate. Now we have a little more with the demand control ventilation, but often a constant ventilation rate and a fixed schedule. For example, if you are depending on window opening schools, they are open between this hour and this hour. But people are not acting this way. They act more in a stochastic way. So in the future, instead of a deterministic modeling of buildings where you get one number for the energy use, we probably will see more use of stochastic variables. Stochastic variable of the people, how they change set points, window openings, and the blinds. And there, instead of then getting one value for, if this here is the energy used in kilowatt hours per square meter down at the right corner, we get a distribution. If the building is not very robust, we get a very wide distribution that the occupant behavior has a significant influence. If it's a more narrow, we find that it's a more robust building. But of course, we would like to see the curve then down at the left, low energy, and a narrow curve. That's something which already is possible now, and it's going to be built in some of the simulation program like Energy Plus are working with building in this possibility. So if you now have a building, you don't get one number for the heating energy use in kilowatt hours per square meter. You get a distribution in where you normally design for the highest. And there you can see how much the building is influenced by occupant behavior. So verification of the models, that's where we use need to use data. So here is a stochastic simulation on, for example, the indoor temperature in bedrooms. The gray area is the simulation results. So we now get an area what we can predict what the temperature would be in the bedroom. And here's the percentage of time it is within or below a certain temperature. So that we will see more, instead of getting one value, we will see more a distribution, like I showed in the beginning, but we will not like to see it, the distribution here. Narrow, yes, because it's robust, but move to the left so we have a low energy use. So summary, in simulations, behavior is just as important as weather and physical properties of the building. So we will never get to zero energy buildings if we are not working with the occupant and take the occupant behavior into account. Models of occupant behavior implemented in existing simulation software. That is something which are going on now. It's not readily available in many software, but the process has started. We need also more studies to investigate what are the drivers: outside temperature, indoor temperature, indoor air quality by CO2 concentration, or others. Or we need large data sets, including all the major driving variables. And we need good validated methods and data to validate the models. And here again, ASHRAE is playing an important role in this activity. And then also the work that is performed, and now it's an older annex in the new annexes. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor, for presenting us this lecture. So I'm just going to move on, so we're not going to run out of time. I am going to share my screen now. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. Oops. So now we are moving to our next lecture with Erin McConaughey. Erin, am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Erin is going to present us the feasibility of natural ventilation and a bit of ASHRAE guide for natural ventilation. So Erin is a principal in mechanical engineering with Arup, an employee-owned global engineering advisory and planning consulting firm. During her 26 years with Arup, she has worked internationally and now leads multidisciplinary design teams in Los Angeles on a wide variety of project types. Erin is a professional engineer in California and Colorado, a lead professional, an ASHRAE accredited high-performance building design professional, and a fellow of the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, also known as ASHRAE. She is also a co-author of the ASHRAE Natural Ventilation Design Guide and writes semi-annually for Engineers Notebooks column in ASHRAE Journal. Thank you, Erin, for joining us. And I'm just going to make you a presenter so you can start.
So
Yep,
are you seeing my screen with the presentation?
Yeah. No,
Excellent.
It's the desktop. It's not a presentation.
So,
yeah.
How about that? Is that better?
Yeah, the feasibility of natural ventilation. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me today. I appreciate it. So today I'm going to start with a story, and it's the story of this building, which is what got me into natural ventilation to begin with. This is the San Francisco Federal Office Building. Back when I was just a very junior engineer, my boss had committed to our clients that we would do a natural ventilation scheme. But then he left the firm and I inherited this project. And so in the end, we ended up with a building that had 12,000 square meters of naturally ventilated space in the upper portion of the tower. And I was able to help to design that building, help to design the controls around that building, and do the analysis around that building. And coming out of that experience, which was a little bit learning by fire, I was invited to participate in writing an ASHRAE journal article. And I apologize, it's saying that I'm too quiet for some reason for the subtitles to come out. But I'll continue acknowledging that we're a bit out of, short on time. So I was invited to write an ASHRAE journal article to share our experience on that project, as well as to reflect on how to give guidance to other people about how to design naturally ventilated buildings. And as part of that exercise, I was able to develop what I called the top 10 feasibility questions related to natural ventilation, the questions that you probably want to ask yourself before you consider using natural ventilation as a cooling comfort method, as opposed to a traditional HVAC system. And they were just rules of thumb. Then, so that was in circulation. And then I got a call from a professor at UC Berkeley, Gail Brager, who was, a key researcher related to natural ventilation in about 2000 or so. And she asked to get a copy of my article, and I asked her why, and she said, well, it's because that's what I teach to my students. I teach from your article in order to tell them how to design natural ventilation. And I said, well, Dr. Brager, surely in the amount of time since we published that article, there must have been some academic research around natural ventilation. She said that there really had not been. So I partnered with one of my ASHRAE colleagues, Peter Simmons, and we agreed. We had both done a number of natural ventilation buildings before in our past. We said perhaps what's useful to the industry is to compile sort of our knowledge together, all of the research that we know from some of our other colleagues, to create a design guide of best practice, as well as cross-referencing different standards. And that is what led to the ASHRAE Design Guide for Natural Ventilation that was published in June of this year. So what I'm going to do today is share with you some of the elements from that design guide to show you sort of how the design guide is structured, some of the key information that's in there, in order to give you an idea of what's there and how to start a project where you might be considering natural ventilation. So one of the key items is that natural ventilation can happen, as you all know, because you're mechanical engineers, only when you have a pressure differential between two openings, or a very large opening that acts as a two-way opening. And the primary mechanisms are buoyancy-driven natural ventilation, where you get a pressure difference because of the change in density of the air mass, or wind-driven natural ventilation, because you have a high pressure side and a low pressure side on one or the other side of the building. Natural ventilation is not new. This is a picture from Robert Boyle back in 1899, where he wrote a book called Natural and Artificial Means of Ventilation. And this little sketch, it's funny, in the little sketch, it says that the whole reason that he was trying to pursue natural ventilation was to prevent products of respiration from infected scholars from getting to each other. So it's obvious to most of us who've taken, fluid dynamics, that natural ventilation only works if there's at least two openings. The amount of airflow that you get is controlled by the size of the smallest opening, and that air will always follow the path of least resistance. So those are just basic physical principles, but sometimes we have to sort of re-explain that. Now in ASHRAE has actually broken up natural ventilation into two pieces. One is what I call natural ventilation, Ventilation is the word, the same way that we use ventilation when we're talking about mechanical ventilation, and that is related to indoor air quality, and therefore it is governed by ASHRAE standard 62.1. When we talk about outside air being used to keep people comfortable, that's when we talk about it as natural conditioning, and that is governed by ASHRAE standard 55. So that's where your thermal comfort is basically controlled. So it's important to keep those two different because there's two different criteria that you have to meet in order to comply with those standards. So obviously the other key international standard that ASHRAE 55 in particular is linked to is the CIBSE, or the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers, basically the UK version of ASHRAE. It's their applications manuals AM10, which is for natural ventilation, and AM13, which is for mixed mode ventilation. So you might ask, what is mixed mode ventilation? Mixed mode ventilation is when you can only use natural ventilation in a certain time of the year or a certain portion of the building. And so you can either have concurrent mixed mode systems where you have natural ventilation for air quality, but you still have cooling. You can have it as being a changeover where sometimes a place is naturally ventilated and sometimes that other place in the building is cooled and you shut the windows. And then the third type is zoned design, where just a portion of the building is always air conditioned and a portion of the building is always naturally ventilated. So when we wrote the book, we really said understanding that those are the ways to understand natural ventilation is how do we know it's going to work for our building, or what would it take in our design to make it work for our building? And so we have this sort of gateway approach, and if I just blow up those titles for you, these are essentially the key themes of the chapters, right? So when should we not even bother pursuing natural ventilation? What do we need to look at in terms of the outside air assessments, facade configurations, the two compliance methods, both the ventilation compliance and the comfort compliance, and then how do you control it if you start having devices that help you to control it? So the key thing I always try to encourage people to talk about with their owners, if they're a designer at the very start, is when do you not pursue natural ventilation? This is related to when you have strict filtration or contaminant dilution concerns, if you have any pressurization or speech privacy. And in particular, you have to check what your internal heat loads are. What CIBSE says is that, your ability to absorb heat is limited, obviously, by the incoming air temperature. That's the equivalent to what you would have had as supply temperature. Because on most days when you would have the windows open, your outside air temperature would be very close to what your indoor air temperature is. And CIBSE recommends that you size your natural ventilation systems for no more than 3 Kelvins difference, 3 degrees Celsius difference, right? But when you look at that against sort of a ventilation rate of what comes in through the window, that means you're still very limited to perhaps only 10 watts per square meter on the low end to maybe 28 watts per square meter on the high end. And that's inclusive of all the heat loads from inside the space that you would want to absorb. So it's very important that you have a high performance facade to keep the solar gains out, and then a low internal heat load density. And so related to that, you also have to have conversations with the client to manage their expectations about the key topics, which is indoor air conditions. People perceive, oh, I'll have better indoor air quality inside, but maybe sometimes people will be uncomfortable, right? And then the other argument that often happens is who has control? Do people have control over the windows? Or are they in some kind of situation where they actually don't get to open the windows, they don't get to change their clothes to be lighter clothes in the summertime, they can't move around to get more air movement? Those kind of situational constraints may kill a natural ventilation scheme. And then last but not least is the cost of ownership. You know, the owner may be thinking that, hey, having natural ventilation will increase market value, but maybe it increases operational risk when we start looking at outdoor air temperatures rising over time. And so I encourage people, and in the book we have these little charts that help you weigh the most common arguments for and against, so that you can have conversations with your owners about, you know, what it will be like for people in the space to be interacting with these types of systems, and is that seen as valuable? So the first thing that we always have to do when we look at a natural ventilation scheme is we need to remember that we don't have filtration of outside air. So we need to check to make sure that our outside air is pretty clean to begin with. When we're in the United States, we can go to sort of a federal government website in order to look at what the air pollutants are, and to see if the air pollutants are even in what's called non-compliance, whether the pollutants even meet acceptable outdoor air conditions. So if you can't even meet outdoor air conditions for particulates or for sulfur dioxide or things, chemicals like that, why would you want to bring even more of that air to the inside without any filtration? So that's a thing that always needs to be discussed with the owner. How good is your outside air? The other thing I always would recommend people look at is, can you rely on wind-driven ventilation, or do you have to design a system around buoyancy-driven ventilation, which has much less capacity to move air, right? Wind, your problem is always, how do I keep the air out so I only have the amount that I need for cooling to come in? With buoyancy, sometimes because it's all driven just by the heat loads in the space, you don't get very much air change out of it. So it's always useful to do a windrows, and there's a couple of free programs that are available that can help people do that relatively quickly. Then the other thing we always have to check is, do we have the right weather outside that would make it financially viable to actually pay for the cost of operable windows? You know, if you are in a climate where between it being very cold in the winter or very hot in the summer or very humid in the mid-season, if you can't get, you know, maybe at least 30% of the times where you could have the windows open, you have to kind of question yourself, is it important to have bought that spare system? Because most places in the world can't be to maintain, you know, ASHRAE 55 comfort, can't be naturally ventilated 100% of the year. They're going to have some heating during some periods and perhaps some cooling. So the operable windows may be an additional cost to a baseline HVAC system that you already bought. And then the other thing that I always have to say, especially with natural ventilation, we do this by upsizing our coils in terms of capacity to accommodate future kind of global warming. But from a natural ventilation system, your entire building and the comfort of the people in the entire building could be put at risk depending on how much your local area is anticipated to rise in temperature over the next 30 years. So I always encourage people as professionals, if they're going to recommend natural ventilation to a client, that they recommend it not just on the basis of looking backwards in 30-year weather files, but looking forwards into a climate shifted file that can be purchased from some of the prominent energy analysis software vendors, buying a shifted EPW file to run and see what it would be like in that location in 2050. So once you understand that you have the right climate, you have the right outdoor air quality, you still want to go forward with the natural ventilation, then we need to kind of work together to make sure that all of the openings in the building are structured so that you can actually get buoyancy, or you can take advantage of wind-driven ventilation. This takes a lot of coordination with the architects because they typically specify windows and where the windows are and how big the windows are, not the mechanical engineer. But the comfort conditioning is completely dependent on those choices. So we have to work very closely with architects in order to be able to achieve that. The other thing that we need to bear in mind is once we know where we want the windows to be, what kind of windows do we want, and how will people get access to them? So sometimes we'll have to, you know, put motors on them so that they'll close overnight, or we'll have to put motors on them because they're too high up near the ceiling that people would not be able to get to them. Sometimes we have to figure out how to have shading devices, because if you have a shading device that's mounted to the wall above the window, and you have the windows open, but you want to pull down the shade because of glare, then actually you just cut off all of the air from coming into the building. And so there are certain devices where you can mount the shades directly onto the window mullion itself. And then the other thing with tall buildings in high rises, there's often a limitation about how big the opening is allowed to be, so that, you know, things don't fall out and fall down to the ground and maybe hurt somebody. And so a lot of codes will limit how big this opening could be, which may restrict how much air can come into the building from a natural conditioning point of view. So when we talk then about, so if you figure that I have the right set of openings, I can get airflow movement across the entire building. Now we have to check whether you have enough airflow to meet the ventilation standards, because just because you can open a window doesn't mean that there's enough sort of heat source in the space or enough wind power coming in to guarantee that throughout every hour of the year when the building is occupied, you get enough ventilation air to match the same table in ASHRAE 62 as you would have to meet if you were using a mechanical ventilation system. So there are now 3 paths available within ASHRAE 62.1 that you can follow in order to prove that you have equivalent ventilation from an air quality and health point of view. Yeah. And so so there's one which is kind of a lookup table, sort of hand calculation or Excel calculation, spreadsheet calculation, approach. There's another one which is a iterative calculation of a single cell model, single cell multi-zone model. And then there's a full sort of engineered system approach with a multi-zone model, which is usually a dynamic heat transfer and bulk airflow modeling tools. And so if I use one of those and I run it through the system, what I'm doing is I'm comparing the actual ventilation I'm able to achieve based on the size of my windows and then the external influences from my weather tape versus the minimum requirements for meeting the ASHRAE 62 threshold flow rate. So liters per second per person or per square meter. So the engineering analysis is what carries the burden of proof that you can meet the equivalent requirements for ventilation. And I usually do that using an 8760 hour file. Now, ASHRAE standard 90.1 doesn't let you get away with looking at those hours where you don't have enough ventilation air, right? So what ASHRAE 90.1 says, if you have hours where the outside air conditions, statistically speaking, cannot be guaranteed to deliver your ventilation air quantity, you have to have a secondary backup system that does bring in the ventilation air for you, and it runs whenever the energy model shows that the temperature is exceeded or the ventilation is too low. So that's important if you're trying to say that natural ventilation is saving you energy in your ASHRAE 90.1 energy model. Then we have to look at people's comfort inside. Now, the important thing to understand in ASHRAE 55 now is a completely different standard. ASHRAE 55 is that usually when people do natural ventilation, they follow one of 2 paths. One is the elevated airspeed path, and they put ceiling fans overhead, and they just move a lot of air at you. The other path is this one called occupant-controlled naturally conditioned spaces, used to be called the adaptive comfort method. And what you'll see here is very interesting. You're allowed in the adaptive comfort method to have a much higher flow velocity coming across people's skin, but you only are allowed to have a limited amount of metabolic rate. So it's basically like offices and classrooms and whatnot, right? And people have to be able to adjust their clothing to accommodate. You're not allowed to have any mechanical cooling installed at all, or else you cannot use this method, because they say if the cooling is there, people will just turn it on. So they would not extend their expectations of comfort accordingly. So if you do have that situation, you do want to follow that bottom path, then you use this diagram, which basically shows that people's understanding in their head and physiologically of what they will allow for a comfort temperature increases depending on what the outdoor temperature on average has been. And what ASHRAE would like us to do is to use a rolling average of outdoor air temperatures for the last 7 to 30 days. And then that would set your lower and higher acceptability limits. And then if you can actually deliver inside the space between the 80% acceptability limits for all hours in the year, then you would be shown to be in compliance with ASHRAE 55 comfort standard. And so the key steps here is to evaluate design against the operable element requirements, right? To run it. If you don't have enough opening, then you need to make bigger openings with the architect. You know, calculate the comfort zone thresholds, do the dynamic analysis, and then you resolve the comfort conditions if it's non-compliant. You do have to do it space by space by space, right? And so when we look at that question between that rolling mean calculation, you know, versus a flat mean, which just takes the average mean temperature for the month, if you're at a very early phase, you could probably just use a flat mean calculation and just find the mean temperature for the month and do the calculations. And you can see that the shape of how many hours of exceedance does not change very much. The actual numbers in each of the colored boxes does. But doing a quick analysis this way, it tells us that, you know, without the red is without any extra fans movement. You know, those are the number of hours per these months that would be comfortable. If you had increased airflow with that elevated speed method, you would be able to be comfortable for these extra hours in the year. And then the purple is basically, it's too hot, right? And so this immediately gives you a kind of snapshot per season of how many hours you might need to do cooling in or heating in. In Los Angeles, we don't have any heating needs for this particular run. And then last but not least, you know, a number of people like to add mechanical devices in order and monitoring systems in order to help to assess whether natural ventilation is working or not. I will give the story of that federal building just to wrap us up. When we first installed everything, people moved in before construction was complete, and therefore commissioning had not yet been finished. I had, because it was a big skinny building, I had a pressure sensor that would measure the differential pressure between the windward side of the building and the downwind side of the building. And I said, okay, open the windows when there's pressure on this side of the building, because that will be the incoming air, and open the windows less on the far side of the building because that will be downstream. And what happened is I didn't put a delay into the sequence of operation that was long enough, so that the windows kept changing back and forth whenever we had turbulent air conditions, outdoor wind conditions, where the air was kind of moving around and from different directions. And the people who moved in thought that the building was haunted. And they were very disturbed by the idea that the windows were moving and they didn't have any control over moving the windows themselves. They had their manual window that was at their desk, but there was extra windows up top that were moving around. So one of the things I just encourage people, and we have some sample sequence of operations here that slow down everything, make recommendations about the types of sensors you might use, the kinds of sequences you might use to override the windows closed if it's too windy or too rainy outside, things like that. But very careful about using mechanical devices for natural ventilation, because really the adaptive comfort method is all about giving people control over the windows themselves. So I'm going to wrap up there. That's my contact information. And again, the book is available. It's really based on all of those key steps that I took you through very quickly. But there's much, much more detail in the book itself, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Erin. You covered a lot of things. Thank you for joining us. Yes, I was going to call Professor Ollison as well. So before we move on, I just want to apologize to our audience. First, because we have a few issues in the beginning, so we started a bit late. Apologize for that. And also I want to apologize for the subtitles. So few subtitles are not working, and we are trying to fix that. Just gonna make me a presenter right
it's
now.
our first tentative, right? See that to implement this kind of technology to help us to make this translation more easy, but well, we are in a process. So sorry everyone for this.
But it worked for your presentation, Sheila.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's working here, but I'm not sure why it is not. Let me see. It's not working for all of you.
No, I don't know why.
Yeah.
So can you see my
no
screen?
problem. Yes, you're there.
Yes.
Okay, so we already have a few questions here. Let me find them here. So first question is, I believe it's Professor Alberto Hernandes from University of São Paulo, to Professor Olsen. What is your evaluation on incorporating higher airflow rates in building as a strategy for reducing COVID contamination in residential buildings?
Well, higher airflow rates will certainly improve, but of course it will also cost more energy. But I think we will see residential building may not always have control of the airflow rate. I think we have a learning process so they know how to operate, because in many cases, I know in Denmark, most residentials is based on openings. So opening a window, but many people, they think just if they have one opening that they have natural ventilation, but they don't. They have to learn that you need to have more openings. So we will see a higher demand for ventilation. I don't know how much in residential, but definitely in offices and others, we will also see how we can ventilate more efficient, not just to have mixed ventilation in the whole space, and because people are only using a small part of the space. So what we are working a lot on is like personalized system where the fresh air comes directly into the breathing zone of people. This also protects you from breathing somebody else's air. And you can do that more efficient, so we don't at the same time could reduce energy. So we are working in European standards, which we are revising now. We will include the parts of this on personalized ventilation, and especially also what to do for in general for cross-contamination, not only COVID. There's also other the flu and others which we can reduce by ventilation.
Yeah, good. So you have also covered a few questions about natural ventilation. So I'm going to give you another question. Like many people are asking about cultural backgrounds and occupant behaviors. So I'm trying to make it one question. So what do you think about cultural background, how it can influence occupant behavior, how it can be measured, since simulations cannot be considered as a standard? I'm trying to make it only one question, but there are a few questions on occupant behavior.
Yeah, well, yes. how occupants behave will definitely have some cultural effect, because it depends on the type of buildings you have been living in, what you have been used to. And where you see this effect the most may be when you change from one culture to another. There you can see that there is an effect on the cultural change. I know we have always learned from home you have to cross ventilate at least 3 times a day, and our mothers always did that in the morning and before you went to bed. And so I don't think others have learned that. What do you do in areas where you have very poor outside air quality, where you basically don't want to ventilate? You better want to close down, where we now see new technologies like air cleaning technologies that may substitute partly for ventilation.
Okay.
But we are not so far. We have models for different cultures, even to have standards, the requirements for indoor temperature and comfort for different cultures. We can take into account difference in clothing, and so we have that. But others, we don't really have that.
Yeah, Erin, do you want to make any comment around that?
No, I think there's not just cultures between geographies, but one of the things we found at the federal building was that there was internal political cultures, and it was always that the bosses had the windows, and they had it in a closed office, and all of the other workers were in the middle. And we had to talk with the owners to say, this is not going to work if you do that. It has to be flipped, that the workers who are there all the time should be next to the windows to get the fresh air, and the bosses should be in the middle because they weren't there that often. Or we could give them sort of a spot cooling system and ventilation system, because mostly they were in sealed offices for privacy reasons. So why waste a good window, on them? That didn't go over so well with some of the unions, but in the end, we were able to make it work.
Well, it's the same. You have to have the women. They should control the thermostat in offices, because they dress according to the seasons. The men, they don't. So most offices, I know in North America, is overcooled. They are not following ASHRAE standards. It's because men, they control the thermostat. The women, they should control it.
So Erin, there is a question here for you. I'm going to ask you if you can briefly answer this one, because we are running out of time, if I may ask you that. So it's from Thais Sartori. Have you performed a post-occupancy evaluation of that building that you have shown in your presentation? If so, how is it performed?
So the government performed a post-occupancy evaluation. The general concerns were not so much about comfort, but more about speech privacy. And then they had some glare issues, which had to do with, sort of how much glass was in the actual facades. Didn't have as much to do with the windows per se, but just the fact that there was 100% glass facade, even though we had external shading devices. So there were some changes that were made in order to retrofit internal blinds after the fact, which is part of why I mentioned the concern about retrofitting blinds, because those weren't originally part of the design from a solar incidence point of view, because we wanted to make sure that the air was able to come into the building. So that was a lesson learned. The maintenance costs were much lower, for obvious reasons, as compared to the benchmarks, but the stability of the temperature that the people inside could expect, there was training and continuous training that needed to happen as new people came into the building, so that they could accommodate their expectations to sort of this alternate scheme. And then in the end, it was decided to turn off all of the upper windows and only open them for night purge and only rely on the lower windows that people could control because there was too much sort of unhappiness with, you know, sort of the ghosts of the building controlling the windows from people's perception.
Okay, thank you. So we still have two.
May I have a comment?
Yeah,
I
sure.
know we have. I don't know if I have time, but it's a lovely. I love this subject, so I take our own night here discussing. But I think a point that Erin bring is that we have some time to adapt the new band of temperature and the people how to could make some relations to the environmental. So here in Brazil, the natural ventilation is still a paradigm. We need to shift this. In our market, we are much more using the international style, so the building are completely sealed, and we are completely moving by the systems and something like that. But probably here in Brazil, we're not able, as you mentioned, to do this during all the day because we have some high temperature in some periods of the year. But probably in a mixed mode or something like that. Maybe in the pandemic bring this a new dimension of internal air quality and the environmental quality too. So how you think that we can move this mindset, because from the designers, from the owners to bring this idea to try to install these strategies in the buildings today, in the stock buildings and the new buildings?
Well, I think when we look into the future and we look at sort of the totality of our professional responsibility, it's also related to carbon emission reductions. So from a climate change point of view, there is some benefit if you can offset certain number of hours in the year to rely on natural ventilation techniques instead of refrigerant-based cooling and all of the energy intensity that comes from, you know, compressors and fans, essentially. And so, but you have to design your buildings differently in order to have a high performance facade, reduce all of your internal loads in order to make natural ventilation work, which also will reduce your carbon emissions from a building. So we need to rethink how we design our buildings to be low energy buildings fundamentally. Then natural ventilation could occur, and then with mixed mode, then you limit the amount of time you rely on the mechanical systems. I think that's really what needs to happen, as opposed to us putting glass boxes all over the world.
Yeah, I think we will see mixed mode buildings. I think is the future. Use the natural ventilation when the outdoor temperature is perfect for that, and also where you don't lose energy because you don't have any heat recovery. But very warm summer, cold winters, you have to use systems, mechanical systems.
Yeah.
Okay. So
and I think you need to go, Sid. I have one question to John, but I have to go. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, because so we are running out of time. Sorry, yes. Juliana. Is that okay?
Thank you so much for your trip. Please, Sid, go ahead.
Yeah, we have two speakers waiting in the wings as well. So I want to thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
Okay, I understand because of the time zone. Erin, thank you. Also, happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
I know it's Thanksgiving in the US. So we're going to move on. So I'm going to invite Jack and Chris. Please, if you can join us, turn on your camera. Hello. We're going to start with Christina. Yeah, welcome, Christina. Welcome, Jack. So I'm just going to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see my presentation.
Yes, so that we can see.
Yeah. So we are moving to session 2 with Professor Christina Candido and with Jack Noonan. So I'm going to start with Christina. Oops. So Christina Candido is associate professor from University of Melbourne. Oops, I don't know what's happening here.
We are seeing, Sida, it's not a problem to us too. Okay. Mhm.
So Professor, she's going to talk to us about from nice have to must have, 5 lessons from Australian workspaces. This is her lecture. So Professor Christina Candido directs the Sustainable and Environment Lab at University of Melbourne, the Faculty for Architecture, Design and Planning. Her research aims to understand and quantify the design, performance and experience of spaces on people. Over the last 10 years, she has run a lot of post-occupancy evaluation survey in workplaces in Australia, Brazil, Europe, and China. She is a member of International Well-Building Research Advisory, WELL faculty, and a technical advisor for GBCA. Hold on, I don't know what is happening with my presentation. Can you see my screen because it's not sharing?
Yes,
Okay.
Now we can see.
And a technical advisor to GBCA and NABER. So please welcome Christina Candido. I'm gonna make you a presenter, please. Yeah, she is a Portuguese speaker.
Falar português 1h da manhã, né? Tem que ter 3 cafés. Cida, como é que eu faço para share my screen?
So you will see a pop-up message on your screen.
Change to presenter, and then
Just choose which screen you're going to share.
no, deny. Tá aparecendo aí, Cida?
Não.
Ainda não, Cris.
Ela tá pedindo autorização aqui, peraí. Eu tenho que mudar para presenter?
Não, eu mudei você. Você só aceita.
Tenta fazer novamente, Cida, porque aí às vezes o pop-up acaba sumindo e aí ele reaparece, talvez ajude.
Eu vou te mandar de novo.
Cida, eu vou mandar para você. Sabe o que é? Talvez seja alguma configuração do meu computador.
Não, eu acho que não, Cris. Ó, vou te mandar o pop-up de novo. E aí você aceita. Você só clica em aceitar. Chegou?
Mas ele... Sim, ele vem, mas ele abre para Assistance Preferences. Então, eu não sei se eu tenho permissão da universidade. Eu vou te mandar agora a apresentação.
Ok.
Mando para você e para a Ju, tá? Eu acho que é bom você falar para o Jack fazer a mesma coisa, talvez. Se o computador dele for institucional, talvez não.
So, just to make it clear for the English speakers, Christina is just having an issue sharing her screen, and I'm just going to have her presentation. So, just wait a few minutes, please.
Eu vou mandar PDF, porque aí fica menor.
Jack, please, if you could send to us the presentation too. Maybe we have some issues. We can present for you. It's okay.
Maybe not. I don't think the problem is mine is an institutional device, so it requires permission, and usually it's locked in, so I can't do it.
So may I suggest if we can start with Jack, and then we can try to solve it on the background, please?
Yeah, whatever you want.
Is that okay?
I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
Not a problem.
Yeah. So Jack, I'm making you welcome.
Thank you.
I'm making you a presenter right now.
Okay.
You don't want to present the bio from Jack first?
Oh, Jack, I'm so sorry. Yes. Let me introduce you first. So we're going to switch presentations. We're going to start now with Jack. Jack Noonan is going to present us the lecture Health and Well-Being in Buildings, What to Expect in the Post-2020 World. Jack Noonan is the Vice President, Asia Pacific for International Well-Building Institute. Jack worked as the Manager of Climate Change Program at Sustainability Victoria, a government agency developing and leading the Take to Climate Change Program and informing state climate policy, working closely with organizations such as NABERS, GBCA, WGBCA, FMA, and ARA, and local state and governments on healthy building design and practices, with a focus on indoor environment. Jack holds a bachelor degree in science and psychology, both from Monash University, as well as a Master of Business focused on the commercialization of science and emerging technology. In 2009, he was a winner of the National Australia Bank Science in Business Award. His areas of expertise include air and water quality, healthy buildings, sustainability rating tools, science commercialization, and climate policy. He is a well-accredited professional and a member of the International Society for Indoor Air Quality. He also serves on the board of a local community organization focused on adult education and social inclusion. Welcome, Jack. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
So
Okay.
I'm just making, could you see a message on your screen?
I'm just trying to work out how to do this though.
It's a pop-up message, and then
I can't see how to do this. Show. Okay, it's asking me to open system preferences and give permission.
Same as Christina, maybe.
Yeah, I don't think we use GoToWebinar very often, but let me just try to do this. It's asking me, it's telling me that I need to quit the session.
No,
we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that.
We don't want that.
Yeah.
That's something we don't want. So let me see.
Okay.
Can you see my?
I think we're okay. This might work. Sure. Can you see my screen?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can see. Now it's working.
It's working?
Yeah.
I don't know how I made that work, but it was that's good.
But I'm glad you did.
Okay. You can see my screen.
Yeah, so over to you now. Yeah, beauty for wellness.
Apologies for the technical glitches, but I'm glad that everybody can see. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit about an approach to building and designing healthier spaces and healthier buildings. And a big thank you to ASHRAE Brazil for having me along today. And it is always lovely and a great privilege to speak alongside my friend Christina Candido. So I'm excited about the Q&A if we have time for it at the end. So my name is Jack Noonan. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, on the lands of the Boonwurrung people. I am the Vice President of Asia Pacific for the International Well-Building Institute. Our organization is headquartered in New York City, but we have people across 8 different countries around the world and are working to progress the healthy buildings movement across the world. We do this through the Well Building Standard. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about this today, but for those of you who aren't aware of the Well Building Standard, essentially it is a standard that looks at what a healthy building is and what a healthy building should be. It's being used by across 98 different countries at the moment, across 33,000 locations. And is essentially informed by peer-reviewed science and people like Christina who inform what the latest and greatest science around healthy buildings is. It goes into the standard and then is applied in practice across the world. So today I want to talk about, so my presentation is going to be a little bit different. I'm not an academic, so I'm going to talk about some of the key trends around the healthy buildings movement to hopefully inform all of you about why this is growing so significantly. I'm going to go a little bit into the detail of what the types of interventions we're looking at are. I'm going to touch on health and safety. I'm going to give some examples of some projects that are focusing on this healthy buildings movement. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about why organizations are prioritizing this and some of the global trends around this as well. And then I'm happy to take questions as well. So the first thing, I'm very conscious that I'm talking to a very well-informed audience here, but I think it's a really important reminder to remind ourselves why we need healthy spaces for people. So when I first started my career, I started my career as a building scientific consultant, and I would often get called in to projects that were suffering from sick building syndrome. So this idea that our buildings were making people sick, itchy eyes, runny noses, headaches, and this idea that buildings can make us sick is not a new concept. Sick building syndrome was a term that was coined in 1984. It's been well established that our buildings can make us unwell. But what we really wanted to try to do at the International Well Building Institute is we wanted to try to flip that narrative. It's no longer good enough for our buildings simply to not make us sick. If we think about health, health is not just about not being sick. It's about a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So when we think about healthy buildings, it's no longer okay to think about healthy buildings as buildings that don't make us sick. It's about buildings that actually help enhance our health and well-being when we spend time in them. Why is this important? I actually studied. Thank you, Sita, for the bio. I actually studied as a geneticist when I was at university, and I always thought that your genetics was something that was far greater in terms of your impact the impact on your health and well-being. As it turns out, the physical and social environment is the #1 determinant of your health, far greater than your genetics, far greater than your access to medical care. So the places that we spend time in, the people that we spend time with, has a much greater impact on our health and well-being than our genetics or than our access to medical care. This is a very overused statistic in our world. We spend about 90% of our time indoors. I think that this statistic has been used so often that it often loses significance. But Professor Richard Corsi, some of you might be familiar with the Corsi Code. He reframes this in a much better way. He says that the average American will live to 79 years. 69 years of that average American's life will be spent indoors, will be spent in a building of some kind. About 5 years of that average American's life will be spent outdoors, and about 5 years of that average American's life will be spent in transit. So it's really important to consider we are spending a lot of time indoors, and if the physical and social environment is the #1 determinant of our health, it's important that we're getting these spaces right. I wasn't able to pull up some similar statistics for Brazil, but I really wanted to emphasize the cost of chronic diseases to our healthcare systems across the world. In Australia, the most expensive disease groups, chronic disease groups, cost the Australian economy around $27 billion. They make up about 36% of all health expenditure. Our leading health professionals say that 1/3 of these diseases are completely preventable. These costs don't even include the lost productivity that is associated with them, or this idea of presenteeism. In Australia, about 98% of Australians will have a chronic disease at some point in their lifetime. 1 in 2 Australians have a chronic disease right now. Despite this, only 1.5% of health spending is dedicated to prevention. The rest of the health spending is actually dedicated to treatment. So it's an inherently unsustainable situation that we've got. We're spending so much time indoors. Our physical our physical and social environment is the #1 determinant of our health. This is impacting the rise of chronic diseases across our communities and across our society. Yet we're not preventing these, we're treating them, and it's an unsustainable solution. So what we're really trying to do with standards is we're trying to position building designers and operations professionals, practitioners, suppliers, and users of these spaces as agents of public health. I deliver presentations like this across the world almost every day, every week at least. And I always say, if there's one thing that I can really emphasize from this presentation, if there's one message, it's that we all, as building professionals who work in this space, are agents of public health, whether we like it or not. If we're spending so much time in buildings, if the physical and social environment is the #1 determinant of our health, we are agents of public health. And what we really need to do is we need to measure, verify, and monitor building features that impact health and well-being. And that's what this healthy buildings movement is all about. And I wanted to kind of leave this section with a quote from Dr. Richard Carmona, who's the 17th Surgeon General of the United States. He put out this quote late last year, and he said, "With the incredible amount of time we spend indoors, buildings must be at the heart of the solution to foster wellness and deliver positive health outcomes at scale. We must embrace a new urgency to achieve our shared vision of advancing health and well-being in all buildings. To be sure, the collective progress we make today to fortify the places and spaces we spend our lives will reverberate long into the future." So next, I want to talk a little bit about the World Building Standard. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but I really want the audience just to have a bit of an understanding of what we're trying to achieve with this standard. So one thing that we say is that a healthy building can't be a healthy building that just focuses on air quality and does nothing in relation to thermal comfort. And that's why I loved Erin's presentation earlier, talking about the interaction or the interactions between ASHRAE 55 and ASHRAE 62. You can't have a healthy building that just focuses on water quality but does nothing in relation to mental health. A healthy building is something that needs to encapsulate all of these aspects of what a healthy building is. So the way that the World Building Standard works is that we have things called preconditions. These are things that every single building that wants to achieve certification or achieve the standard must do. You can see that there is a precondition in every single one of these concepts or every single one of these categories. It means that if for this building to achieve certification, it needs to address all of these preconditions, it needs to address all of these different topics. And then we have something called optimizations, which are optional interventions or optional credits that the project can implement to target different levels of certification. Something important to emphasize is that this is not just about design. Design will only take you so far. It's about how the building is operated and maintained after the building has been handed over. It's also important to consider behavior. And when we talk about behavior, we're talking about policies. So how are spaces, how are organizational policies being implemented across a space or across an organization to really make sure that the design intent is being met? It's all well and good to have a wellness room designed into a commercial office building. But if that wellness room is not being operated and maintained in an adequate way, so it's not left in a state of disrepair, if the organizational leadership is not providing the policies or the leadership around how to use that space, ultimately that workplace wellness room will fail. So you can design the best space in the world, but unless it's matched with ongoing operations and policies to support that, it will fail. So what we're really looking at is a combination of design, operations, and behavior change aspects to how we can actually get the best health outcomes from people within these spaces. The other aspect of the standard is performance testing. So once again, it's not just about designing for good air quality, it's about testing for good air quality and actually understanding, is the quality of the air within the space actually under certain thresholds. So this is something that is very, very important to the standard and very important to certification. So we're physically testing air quality, water quality, lighting, acoustics, and thermal comfort. And then depending on which credits or features that you pursue, you get different levels of certification. So I wanted to touch on next what's important in a healthy building. Now, I don't have time to go through every single category or every single concept of the well building standard, and I don't think that's the intention of today. But I wanted to touch on 3 key aspects. So I wanted to touch on air, water, and mind, because I think that for this audience, maybe mind is something that is a little bit new and potentially a little bit interesting as well. So first, let's talk about air. So air, obviously environmental air quality is a global concern and something that we need to address. When we talk about air, it's really important, and I know that this audience would be quite familiar with this, but we breathe in 15,000 litres of air every day. And what we breathe in is actually having a huge impact on our health and well-being. In terms of the sources of poor indoor air quality, you can see here I'm sure many of you would be familiar with this particular study. It's a little bit old now, but you can see here that inadequate ventilation is the #1 source of poor indoor air quality, followed by contamination from inside the building, and then several other factors as well. What we're really trying to do with the well building standard is we're trying to ensure high levels of indoor air quality across a building's lifetime through a diverse range of strategies that include source elimination or reduction, active and passive building design, and operational strategies and human behavior interventions. So we're looking at things like ventilation, operable windows. We're looking at high levels of filtration across the space. Things like MERV13 filtration. We're looking at reducing the amount of construction pollution throughout the design of the building. Obviously, there's some things around smoking and maintenance and operation controls, and we're also looking at microbe and mold control as well. So this is what a feature within the well building standard looks like. This is all completely open source. If you're interested in some of the thresholds for some of these contaminants, I would recommend you jump on and have a look at these. But there are thresholds for particulate matter, both PM2.5 and PM10. There are thresholds for organic gases, inorganic gases, radon, and also a requirement for organizations to monitor this on an ongoing basis. So it's not sufficient for you just to measure the contaminants once during the certification process. You need to actually commit to monitoring these air parameters on an ongoing basis. The next I want to talk about is water quality and really understanding why we need good water quality across our buildings. So essentially, what we know is that access to safe and clean drinking water was declared a human right by the United Nations General Assembly back in 2010. However, 663 million people still do not have access to improved water sources, and manufacturing and agriculture have introduced new contaminants to our water systems, which is causing huge issues across our water supply system. We can see here that some of these contaminants are regulated, but many are not regulated. And this poses a significant issue to the trust of our water quality systems across the world. And we know that a distrust in water globally leads to, #1, individuals opting for bottled water, which is an inherently unsustainable solution, or 2, opting for sugar sweetened beverages, which has other health impacts as well. Which is exactly what I say on this particular slide. So people who mistrust the safety of their water can be more likely to have lower intake of water and high intake of sugar sweetened beverages. So it's really important that we consider how water travels, because this is something that is often, I think, confused across the built environment industry. The water supply to a building can be contaminated at the source, in the supply lines, at the building connection, in the building piping, or inside the plumbing fixtures at the point of use. So there are a whole range of different locations where water quality can be compromised. This is why we need to think of interventions. We need to think of testing requirements that address the contamination across the entire water supply. So when we're talking about water quality within the standard, what we're really looking at is how we can treat water and understand the quality of water that is coming out of the tap that people are drinking, and how we can bring transparency back to that process. So it's all well and good for a facility manager to measure the quality of the water that's coming out of the tap, but it really is for nothing unless that information is provided back to the occupants so that they can build that trust and have that transparency within their water quality system. We're also looking at design interventions that can promote drinking water access. We're looking at moisture management, and we're also looking at provisions around hand washing as well. So finally, the last concept that I wanted to address is the mind concept. And this is the way that our buildings can impact our mental health. So workplaces and our buildings can support positive mental health or contribute to poor mental health. An estimated 18% of adults will experience a common mental health condition, such as anxiety, depression, or substance abuse over a 12-month period. And over 30% of adults will experience a mental health condition during their lifetime. Approximately 2/3 of individuals experiencing common mental health conditions are currently employed. So this is something that is a workplace, it is a building issue. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to design spaces to support mental health. So how we feel in a space can be influenced by a variety of design strategies. This may include wayfinding, it can include spatial adjustment, it can include restorative spaces, and it can also include the incorporation of nature. This idea of biophilic design, which is this desire and need for humans to be connected to nature. So what we're really looking at through the mind concept is really about how we can promote mental health outcomes through the design, operations, and policy initiatives across a building. Like I said before, it's all well and good to design a good workplace wellness room, but if it's not actually being supported by organizational leadership and the ongoing operation of that space, it will fail. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to incorporate different design, technology, and treatment strategies to support mental health within the workplace. This is a really nice little project in Sydney, and you can see here that it's really incorporated. This is the middle of an office space. It's really tried to incorporate biophilic elements. There are nature sounds. There's the feeling of this space is quite unique compared to the rest of the office space. And it's a place where people actually enjoy spending time because of this nature wonderland that they've created. So next, I want to talk about a couple of projects, two very different projects in Australia that are implementing some of these design strategies. So 60 Martin Place in Sydney, this is a very iconic building. It's one of the most expensive buildings in Sydney. It's owned by organizations called Evento and Grenville, and they had a number of goals for this development, but one was to really demonstrate global best practice as it relates to healthy buildings. And as part of that, they really want to focus on tenant health and well-being to attract high-level tenants to this particular building. So tenants feel when they surveyed tenants after they'd been in this building for a little while, tenants felt a sense of trust in this building. So there was a significant focus on ventilation and an assessment of ventilation possibilities, and also monitoring ongoing air and water quality. They also had a tenant engagement app and had a number of different health interventions that supported the return to work when Sydney came out of lockdown. Beyond health and safety, some of the innovative strategies include extensive use of automated blinds to manage glare and mitigate discomfort for building occupants, to encourage occupants to integrate physical activity into their daily routines. 60 Martin Place offers extensive end-of-trip facilities, including bike parking, showers, changing rooms. The building is located centrally, allowing many options for active and public transportation. Further, the photo on the left shows the open air staircase that encourages occupants to opt for the stairs rather than using the elevator. The natural environment is incorporated throughout the building to support psychological well-being. 60 Martin Place also boasts panoramic harbour views, and very close proximity to the Royal Botanic Gardens as well, to really encourage people to access blue and green space throughout the day. Another project that is really important to talk about is 500 Collins Street in Melbourne. The reason why this project is so important is because it's a 50-year-old building. It's a relatively old building in the middle of Melbourne, and often when people talk about the healthy buildings movement, they say that this is only possible for new and shiny buildings. And what we really wanted to do was we wanted to demonstrate, and it has been demonstrated through 500 Collins Street, that any building can be a healthy building. This building has not done much to it in terms of incorporating new capital expense or made significant improvements to any of their systems. But because they have existing systems that perform well, that they maintain properly over time, they were able to demonstrate that this was the highest level of healthy building as acknowledged by the International Well Building Institute. So something that the managing director of this building owner mentioned is that he said that existing building owners don't have to invest millions and millions of dollars to make their buildings healthier. This can be done by just focusing on key initiatives throughout the operations of the building. This is what the building looks like. It's a relatively, it's a relatively average looking building. It looks like any other building in Melbourne. But some of the key aspects that they've included was some new walk-off mats, as you can see in the reception area of this particular building, and this minimises the amount of particulate matter from outside that enters the building. In addition to this, the building displays live air quality readings in public spaces, adding an extra element of transparency and trust with the building. Now, this kind of aspect of displaying real-time air quality monitoring within buildings is something that has been very common in places like China for the last 5 years. I'm not sure if this is common in Brazil, but this isn't something that we haven't really seen much of across Australia, because indoor air quality and ambient air quality is something that Australia has really taken for granted over many, many years. But with increasing incidences of bushfires and very devastating bushfires, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, occupants are really looking for that increased transparency from building owners. So displaying real-time air quality monitoring of indoor spaces is something that we've seen really increase in prominence. So the next thing that I wanted to do is just very quickly talk about health and safety in a post-pandemic workplace. So something that Dr. Joe Allen, who was one of our co-chairs on a special task force, mentioned is that if managed poorly, buildings can spread disease, but if we get it right, we can enlist our schools, offices and homes in this fight. He mentioned this in February 2020. And in February 2020, as many of you would know, many governments, many health organizations were still debating whether or not COVID-19 was transmitted via the air or via airborne transmission. And this is something that Joe and many others were advocating for very, very early in the pandemic. And unfortunately, many governments and many health organizations responded too late. We set up a task force which included a number of important health professionals from across the world to really look at what are some of the key interventions that we can look at both now and into the future around how we can reduce the risk of respiratory infections within the built environment. We launched a special report that is over 350 pages long, has been authored by over 600 leading medical and health, public health practitioners, called Prevention and Preparedness, Resilience and Recovery. If you're interested in what the future of building science looks like as it relates to reducing the risk of infectious diseases within the built environment, I would highly recommend you read this particular report. Something that we looked at was what are some of the key interventions from the standard that can reduce the risk of infection within the built environment. And here we have some 5 key features that we looked at. So we're looking at how we can improve ventilation effectiveness, how we can enhance ventilation, so increasing the outdoor air rate within our buildings, how we can provide operable windows that aren't just there because they're nice to look at, but they can actually be operable, how we can implement better air filtration, and how we can also incorporate microbe and mold control within our building systems as well. The other thing that the task force looked at was they implemented something called the Well Health Safety Rating, which was a new rating that resulted out of the task force. And with these, there were 5 key topics that the task force really recommended that we focus on in order to reduce the risk of COVID-19. I don't have time to go through all of them, but one that I wanted to touch on was air and water quality management. So for air and water quality management, what we're really looking at is we're looking at how buildings right now, and this is something that is not for the design of new buildings, this is something for buildings that currently exist and need to put in some immediate controls to understand their risk of COVID-19 and other respiratory infections. But this is this particular concept or group of strategies within the rating is really looking at how you can assess your ventilation right now, assess and maintain your air treatment systems. So not necessarily saying that you need to put in new filtration systems or new air treatment systems straight away, but really getting an understanding of what your systems are capable of. Unfortunately, a lot of facility managers, a lot of building managers aren't really sure of what their systems are capable of. And when COVID basically was emerging, many organizations, many commercial organizations were offering new solutions to these building managers, and many of them just weren't suitable for the systems that they had. So really understanding your ventilation system is really important. Developing a Legionella management plan is also very important. For many of these buildings where there were significant lockdowns across a particular city or across a particular country, these buildings remained inoperational. And that led to stagnant water within potable water systems, where even in Australia, we've had incidences of Legionella from potable water systems when organizations have gone back to after lockdowns. And then we've also got things like monitor air and water quality and manage mold and moisture as well. So finally, I wanted to talk a little bit very quickly about why organizations are prioritizing this. What are some of the global trends? So some of the key reasons why organizations are suddenly looking at healthy buildings. It's not because suddenly people understand healthy buildings really well. As much as all of us would like to, who work in this space, would like to think that's the case. It's really, I think it's more around, this is becoming a demand from both investors and from the people that work for these organizations. Something that we're seeing is that even before the global pandemic, about 76% of workers reported that they're struggling with their health and well-being. And if we think that the physical and social environment is the #1 determinant of their health, in investing into the buildings and making them healthier buildings is actually a way that we're addressing workers that are struggling with their health and well-being, making their experience when they're at work far greater than what it would be if there weren't those health and well-being interventions. This is something that is definitely coming through. Once again, these statistics are pre-pandemic. Some of these statistics would be even greater as a result of the global pandemic. But this is becoming an expectation from not just Gen Z, but it's becoming an expectation across all generations, that job seekers are looking for organizations that care about their health and well-being. Employers are looking at how they can attract new talent to their organization and how they can use health and well-being programs to actually enable this. Many of you would be familiar with, when you actually look at the costs of a building, about 90% of the costs of that building are the salary or the benefits of the people within that building. About 9% is the rent or the operations of that building, and about 1% is energy. And that's not to say that we shouldn't focus on energy efficiency. It's not to say that we shouldn't focus on making our buildings more efficient. But I think that we need to start focusing on how we can improve the experience of the people within the building, because there are significant benefits associated with that. ESG, which is the new framing of sustainability, so environmental, social, and governance, is really being framed into two kind of buckets. It's being framed in terms of interventions that can improve human capital or people, and interventions that can improve climate change and the planet. These are not competing interests. These are complementary interests, and all of the top building owners in the world are very much focused on both of these topics in order to demonstrate to their investors that they're taking sustainability seriously. One thing that we've seen particularly recently is the rise of social sustainability and the need for standardized health performance metrics as it relates to our built environment. And something that that Laura Craft has spoken about, she said that during the last economic downturn, so in 2009, 2010, environmental factors got their legs. Back then, when we focused on energy and sustainability, we could increase our net operating income. Fast forward to the current situation, and social factors are paramount. People want healthy and safe spaces to occupy. This is fundamentally driving the interest in healthy buildings at the moment, and the interest is growing and growing and growing. And finally, one thing that I wanted to mention is an increasing focus on health equity. All of these healthy building interventions will mean nothing if we're not addressing all of the people in our spaces, and taking a health equity approach. So typically we see that there's about a 20 to 40% average participation in corporate wellness offerings. For those of you who have worked for organizations, this is where you have a workplace wellness program. Unfortunately, the 20 to 40% of people who participate in those corporate wellness offerings are those that probably need those health interventions the least. So what we really need to do with this healthy buildings movement is we need to ensure that through good quality air, through good quality lighting, through good quality thermal comfort, that we are developing passive interventions within our spaces so that all people within those spaces can benefit from the healthy building intervention. And that's something that's very important as we move into the next phase in this healthy buildings revolution. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today, and I'm happy to take questions after Chris's presentation as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jack, for bringing us this industry and Australian overview. I believe it's very important. Chris, yeah, Chris is here. So I'm just going to share the screen. Just let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Yep.
You're very welcome.
All right. Boa noite, todo mundo que ainda está aí no Brasil. É um prazer apresentar para vocês de manhã aqui em Melbourne. So welcome everyone to this presentation. It's a great pleasure to join this, otherwise very interesting session. I'll be talking about some of my research in corporate workplaces in Australia, and really trying to focus on 5 lessons out of the, over the 10 years experience here, but also trying to tease up some of the challenges and the unknowns considering, COVID and where we're heading next. So my name is Christina Candido. Yes, I'm Brazilian, but I work as associate professor with the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Melbourne, where I direct the SHE Lab. Cida, can you go to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
It's still on the first one.
Still on the first one?
Yeah.
Wait a second. Here you go.
That is right. So Jack just used the saying statistic. It's really one that we really like to talk about. But I'll bring that one back in front of you because I think that really justifies the business case for high performance workplaces, which is really what motivates me. I think we do spend a lot of time documenting issues, which is really important around workplaces, especially workplaces that perhaps underperforming. So there is a wealth of knowledge around this, but that is not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in actually looking and investigating what makes spaces high performance. And, the main reason for that is, we spend so much time indoors. It has been estimated that we spend 9% of our time indoors during our lifetime. And out of these, about 90,000 hours of this at work, which of course COVID changed that. We're not necessarily working from HQs, but we are still very much indoors. And as a result, you'll be impacted as, there will be short-term impacts on your health and well-being and your satisfaction and productivity, but there will be also long-term impacts of the same kind. So when you think about indoor spaces from a public health sort of perspective, it does make sense to look after these spaces and actually to map, understand, quantify, and improve from a human health perspective. Next slide, please, Cida. Yeah, so why workplaces? Not only we spend so much of our life in workplaces, perhaps way too much. But I find workplaces fascinating because they're always changing. So when you look back in the last 50 or 60 years of workplaces, we moved away from what was otherwise an individual office, a private office that people will have, and the top dog gets the corner office with a nice view, all the way to a space that is completely shared, open plan offices, where you would have desk ownership and sometimes you wouldn't have desk ownership. Then co-working, which is a completely different way of using this space and operating this space. And then, of course, only to be hit by COVID. So workplaces are a very dynamic topic of research because you have to keep up with these changes. But with change, there is a side of it that expectations will change as well. And I think COVID brings something quite interesting about that. I'll talk about it later. But we also get used to situations and spaces and ways of working that perhaps didn't exist before. So it's you really need to be continuous assessing how we work and where we work from, and if there is this match, if that's actually working and supporting you as you go by your work activities every day. So I'm really attracted to this topic because it's very dynamic. Next slide, Cida, please. So if you do think about the way that you work and where you work from, just take like 2 seconds to think about that before COVID and post-COVID, or during COVID, because we're not yet in a post-COVID sort of scenario. We're still going through the motions. Think about the way that you work. Think about the way that you like to work. Think about where you work from. Is there a match between the quality of space and the infrastructure that you have available to you in your workspace with the way that you as an individual not how your organization wants to work, but how you want to work. So that is the first question, is there a mismatch there? And if not, then great. But if there is, where is it coming from? And then the second question for you to reflect on is there a mismatch between the way that you as an individual want to actually work? Is that because of the where, the when, on how you work, and the way that your organization sees that as being appropriate for that particular group of workers? I would, if I would guess, I would say that most of you would find mismatches on both ends, on the way that you want to work or you would prefer to work is slightly different perhaps on the way that your organization wants you to work. On the other side, the infrastructure that the organization provides you with, there is also a little bit of a mismatch there with your personal preferences and where you work from. And that's exactly where the issues are coming from. The issues that are coming from that you observe in any workplace in Australia, but around the globe, comes from this mismatch of how we want to work and where we want to work from. I could even add the when and how, but I'm gonna just focus today on the how and where we want to work from. And these are the two key issues when it comes down to high performance workplaces, is this incredible mismatch that I'm always amazed by, that we keep finding through the research. Next slide, Sida. So when we look at the infrastructure and when we look at how we work in the work process, it's quite interesting because in practice, and I mean, a lot of other people have measured this before I attempted to, in practice, there is a wealth of evidence actually saying that working partners show that the total headcount in an organization is not, it's more than 70% of staff is likely to be in the office at the same time. So that is something to keep in mind. We're never there together at any point, any given time. And this is before COVID, right? So the allocated average desk occupancy is always below 50%. And that is irrespective of the business sector. So across the board, what we find is not all of us are going to be on site all the time. And even when we are, we're not necessarily sitting at our desk, because that is just how we work, right? So what makes you think about is, well, then, if we're never there together, not all of us at any given point in time, and even when we are there, the ones that are there are not necessarily sitting at a desk. So when you look at any office, and if you be in an office, either you work there, you do research, whatever, you see that there will be always spots that are going to be empty. And that is a significant issue, because if you think it from an environmental perspective, you're wasting resources because you're pumping cooling or heating in a space that is, underutilized. But you also have the aggregated sustainability increased footprint, because you actually having building materials, you having furniture being provided there for nothing, for no one. So what is it? Why do we keep talking about different ways of working and new ways of working? Because we need a variety of work settings. And that has to do with us as workers performing different activities. See, again, if you think about your day, what is it that you do? I'm giving this presentation now. I'm going to go for a walk later. Then I have a meeting later. Then I'm going to go for a coffee. So you're doing several different activities during your routine. And during your work day, that will indeed require different settings. Next slide, Sida, please. So when you combine these, the logic around the way of working, that we're actually performing several different tasks every day, regardless of the industry sector that you work from, what happens with the space and the infrastructure of the space is it's actually there to accommodate how we work, right? So how it has changed from a physical environment perspective over the last 50 or 60 years. Well, we, as I started saying in this presentation, we moved away from a cocoon, a little bubble of an office, which was the cellular individual office that would basically be our little kingdom, and then you would perform and expect to perform all activities within those 4 walls. If you would be having meetings, if you would be having any, probably not phone calls, but phone calls, not teleconferencing, but all the work activities will be taking place within this. And you can still find that, especially in university sectors, academics like to, hold on to our individual offices. But then progressively, all these ideas of new ways of working, of course, there is a cost benefit. We're not going to ignore that. Trying to remove the physical barriers to allow people to interact, see each other, and then be able to promote collaboration and innovation by making them visible. And then, hold and behold, there was the birth of open plan offices. But even within the open plan offices, and I'm bringing these 2 typologies on the side, which is, the traditional open plan office that you would find, which is the one in the middle, and then the one on the right side, it's a different way of organizing the space. So they both open plan office configurations, but they're very different in the way that the space is organized. The first one is basically trying to have everyone working from the desk and performing all the work activities from the same location. So there is desk ownership is present, but then of course you start seeing all the issues around acoustics, not surprising, just to cite one. You have a whole bunch of people working from the same location all the time and generating a lot of noise, as I am at the moment. As opposed to actually having a different configuration where if you would be doing what I'm doing now, I would probably be going to a room with walls. I wouldn't be in the open plan area, just talking and then kind of impacting other people around me. So they both open plan offices, but they actually look and feel very different. And that is really important to keep in mind. Next time you're reading papers about open plan office, think about CRAZE and say, we actually need to figure out where this research was conducted, because open plan offices, even if you're using the same label as calling them open plan offices, they can actually be very different. And that is a significant issue. But then, of course, this is before COVID, right? And now we're living in this point in time in workplace research that is full of unknowns and question marks. So I love this Twitter. Every time that I read it, I laugh because it does make me laugh. I think it really encapsulates the feel. If the NASA team landed a rover on Mars from their living rooms, I don't want to hear anything from executives about remote work process not working. So we have proven as an entire generation, different generation of office workers, that we can actually perform our work out of HQ. But see, this is the thing, is because we can doesn't mean that we should. It doesn't mean that all of us want to. So it's a really interesting time in workplace, I think, is strategy, workplace management, and research as a whole, where all of us as workers around the globe experienced at the same time remote working and being away from HQ at a scale, of course, that has never been seen before. And as such, of course, our expectations in returning to HQ are forever changed. What we learn about, being away from HQ and the benefits, and I'm going to show some results from Australia on that. Being away from HQ has its positives, the negatives as well. So learning about both worlds, the good, the bad, and the ugly about remote working has changed our views and attitudes towards HQ. So that's the next configuration of the post-COVID workplace. It's still very much a question mark. Different organizations are, trying to experiment perhaps with different strategies. We've been documenting and understanding what's happening around the globe, at different points in time. We know that working from home, if you are in a lockdown situation, it's completely different than if you're actually working from home under no lockdown restrictions. It's very different. But then where we headed next, it's a question mark. Next slide, please. So in terms of the physical configuration of a space, you see all of these elements being implemented in contemporary workplaces, and that is again a response to the different ways of working in the different spaces that you need to support that, all the way from spaces that are very much individual spaces where you should go to do some sort of concentration work away from your colleagues and noise, to anywhere spaces which are actually spaces that are even outside, let's say, the office HQ sort of perimeter, but that is still very much an extension of your workplace. So places that you go to meetings, workplace hubs, satellite offices that some organizations sometimes have, or even co-working spaces that are rented out for workers that are visiting. So all of these spaces, either if they are within the HQ sort of environment and out of the HQ environment, there was already a trend in trying to have what we think as a network of workplaces, and COVID is just accelerating that, which is quite interesting. Some organizations were here in Australia already talking. I had this conversation with some organization maybe 5 years ago, where they really wanted to have satellite offices implemented, scattered around, how did they have, and building really large buildings in CBD to host 8,000, for example, occupants. And they would be completely ahead of curve. You could have chosen to go down that track, but they decided against. But there was a lot of conversation around this. So I think what is important is, though, these spaces, they still relevant. And when we're attracting people back to HQ, they're going to be more relevant than ever. Next slide, Sidham. So what I was saying in terms of the two, different configurations of open plan offices, these are open plan offices, right? Both of them, but look how different they are. One of them, you have the traditional sort of lineup with the workstations, people working together with having 4 different workstations together. And then you have the meeting rooms, and the individual offices usually are located for managers at the bottom, as opposed to having another floor plan that is completely broken down into different nodes and spots. And these spots of different size and shapes and configurations are designed to support different work activities. That is a very different open plan office. Both of them will have issues, negatives, pitfalls, shortcomings, whatever you want to call it, but they also come with different ways of experiencing the space and, of course, different levels of satisfaction. What I've learned over the last 10 years is the second configuration, which has a variety of work settings being offered to people, tends to outperform always by far the conventional setting. So that is the first thing. A variety of work zones is very much needed, and desk ownership is not necessarily what determines that. It's more about having this marriage between the way people work and where they work from. Next slide, Sidham. So of course, open plan offices keep getting a bad reputation. Before COVID, if you type, this is just a screenshot, if you type on Google open plan office, this is what you're gonna find. Is open plan office a good idea? Why open plan offices are bad for us? Disadvantage of open plan offices. And then of course, the Harvard Business Review study, which is being circulated around the globe. And then of course, every single thing that comes up is always of negative configuration or connotation. Now, why and where to is where I'm kind of more interested. As I said, I look at this thing as a problem that needs to be solved, and we only going to learn how to solve if we find solutions or situations where it's actually performing well. So I've been documenting spaces that, yes, are open plan offices, but from the user's perspective, somehow they work. So I'll bring some of these elements in this presentation. Next slide, please. So when we're looking of where we are now, going back to the first question where I started, if you think about how and where you work, think also, I think post-COVID, when is also relevant, because we are not necessarily bound to 9 to 5 anymore. Fingers crossed that is going to continue. So I see this as where we are. You have the pre-COVID workplace, which we have a lot to learn from, that is still very relevant, because of course we're moving back to HQ. But then you have this middle sort of ground, which is the rise of the hybrid workplace, and which has been perhaps over the last 2 years, that's actually where we are. You have us going in and out of lockdown, which very different experiences if you have kids around, if you don't have kids around, if you're by yourself, if you have family, if you're caring for the elderly. So very different experiences when you're working from home during lockdowns, post-lockdown. And then even when we're out of lockdown, different organizations have been having a different take on this. Some organizations, as soon as public health say it's okay, they tend to go back to HQ immediately, where we see organizations waiting. So I know organizations here in Australia that, for example, are waiting to return to HQ in Sydney just in February. So you're completely free to choose when you're back in HQ between now and then. And the motivation then, the logic then was, it's end of the year. It's been a really tough year. We know these people are going to continue to work, but we also want them to actually take leave and spend time with family during the festive season and summertime, rather than be worried about a roster that we're imposing on them. So these are different takes of different organizations. So it's kind of, you're going to find pretty much every single thing in between the spectrum. And then, of course, a lot of questions around what is this post-COVID workplace. There were lots of discussion last year around, if the open plan office is dead, if the office is dead, and so on and so forth. And now, people trying to return, and how do you tease people back into HQ? How you go about that? Next slide, please. So some of the lessons that I can bring today. Well, the first one is we keep talking about, I'm always amazed how some managers are surprised by people not wanting to go back to 9 to 5 and HQ bound kind of, style of working. Well, this is a survey from 2018 led by Deloitte. It was an international a study that they did in many different countries, and it was focusing just on millennials, because that was the hot topic 5 years ago. It was understanding what the millennial workforce wants. And this is, I totally recommend you to read the full report, but I just want to draw attention to one of the graphs that they have. They asked millennials, if they would stay, they consider staying the next 5 years with the same organization. And then they look to the different levels of flexibility that the two groups had. People that had access to more flexibility, they had more control over when and where they work. 55% of them said that they would continue to work from that organization for the next 5 years. But when you look at the other group that had less flexibility, less control over where and when they work, only 17% said that they were going to continue to work for that organization. Now, that alone, it's an interesting find, because if you're trying to, it's hard enough to attract talent, but to keep talent is far more difficult. And you don't want to be facing churn and have all the knowledge in the person that you train so hard, that is doing so well, to leave and go elsewhere after you invested so hard on them. So yes, there is a war on talent, in attracting talent, but it's even hard to actually keep people on the same job, especially depending on the industry sector. So that was already there. The appetite for flexible working arrangements, it's there, it was there. What changed is we got to experience it. So the second graph is some of the findings from the research that we did here in Australia, and asking people what were the best aspects of remote working. Well, number one, not surprising, not have to commute from and to work, more time with family, ability to perform more focused work. So keep that one in mind. Work-life balance and less stress at the start of the working day. I think we can all relate to all of these factors, but this is the lesson one. The rising expectations around flexibility, they were already building up. The appetite was already there. Now it's forever changed, because we all got to experience that. And of course, to get people going back to HQ, well, there will be a few conditions for that to take place. You can't just have, hopefully not, a stick approach to that. So what is the carrot? Second lesson, next slide, please, Sida. Second lesson, well, we actually do need to have a serious conversation about workspace design. So the other one was how and where we work, how and when we work. This one is about where we work from. When we look at the research in Australian workplaces before COVID, the key source of dissatisfactions found here had to deal with insufficient spaces to concentrate and perform deep work, insufficient number of meeting rooms, insufficient number of spaces for private conversations, insufficient number of breakout spaces, and the layout overall did not cater for work activities. So spaces were failing people. That's how I read this. This is the finding. This is the so what of the graph in the research. Workspaces were failing people as the infrastructure intended to support how they work. That's just simple as that. So in a post-COVID scenario, when we asked them, in a post-COVID scenario, not surprising, 4 out of 10 said that they want to work from home indefinitely. This is likely higher compared to other countries, especially what I've seen the research coming out of US and Europe. And then the 6 out of 10 workers want to have at least access to, if they're not allowed to work from home indefinitely, the increased offering of flexible working arrangements. But then they also express a desire to see changes, 5 out of 10 major changes on the design of the office. And then, of course, 5 out of 10 equally major changes on the way that they use the workspace. So these two results together, when you put it, when you combine them, again, it just justified that these people work in spaces that were not really supporting what they need to do when they are at HQ. And then by being performing work away of HQ, of course, they had more control over either thermal comfort conditions, perhaps not so much acoustics. That is a little bit trickier if you're working from home, but you actually, by being able to control your surroundings in a way that is very different from a shared space, of course, you would have a different expectation by the time you return to the office. So there was already a need to have this serious conversation about workspace design, but now it's more than ever. Next slide, please. This one, I'm sure Jack's gonna love it, but this is just what the reality, that's what the evidence tells me. Healthy workplaces are indeed a thing. That is no longer a trend. It was a nice to have before COVID. They're here to stay. They are a must have post-COVID. So when I look at the research that we did in Australian workplaces over the years, healthy equals high performance workspaces, always, always. When you look at the blue line of the spider graph, you see that well-certified premises in Australia will outperform just as high-end, workplaces, corporate workplaces, in pretty much every single indoor environmental quality parameter that I ever put in front of them. By having surveys that actually go beyond the indoor environmental quality parameters to include other aspects, for example, organizational aspects, we're actually finding the same results. So from a human, an environmental, and organizational perspective, well-certified premises will outperform similar corporate high-end offices in Australia, always. I think in moving forward, some of these challenges when it comes to health, physical and mental health, and overall well-being, some of the things that we're picking up from the research, yes, well, not surprising, is stress, reported stress and burnout extremely on the rise with people working through the pandemic. There are different reasons why that is happening, not only because of increased workloads, but also, of course, hey, it can't be business as usual. There is still a pandemic out there. So stress and burnout is definitely on the rise. Physical discomfort and reporting pain, which comes with the issues and challenges of properly setting up offices away from HQ. Not all of us have the means, the knowledge to actually have a proper working from home, home office setup that supports you. So that is being on the rise, and that is a significant issue. Reported physical activity, and even more the physical activity. Physical activity is on decline. Sedentary behavior, or the time that we spend seated, is on the rise. If you work from home, you tend to take less breaks, and if they do take breaks, they're very short. So you spend more time bound to your desk. And that is a significant issue when it comes to physical health. Perceived productivity is on the rise, and we get to learn more about links between stress and burnout and this push in increased perceived productivity. We're working ourselves down to the bone, and that is not sustainable. And then, of course, we need to understand more about perceived mental health, which has been deemed as, a huge issue, and I believe it is. But we also need to separate some of these elements when it comes to the workplace. So, in moving ahead, that is definitely something that is still gonna continue on people's radar. Next slide, please. Workplaces, I think we learned by now that we do have this very complicated relationship with our workplaces. Some of the remote working challenges in Australia, internet connectivity. Yes, my friends in Brazil, maybe you don't have that issue, but we still do here. It's a big deal. Challenges are now around furniture ergonomics and setup of home offices, stress and burnout, isolation from colleagues, and the inability to establish a consistent routine. So yes, it's great to be able to have more control over where and when we work, but it comes with challenges as well, and we need to look after that. It'll be quite interesting in moving forward how organizations will consider, where does the duty of care ends. So if we take a simple example of the furniture ergonomics and office setup, we actually need to train people, right? Because if they're working anywhere, that is of responsibility of the employee, isn't it? You're still working and producing work away from HQ. But then if you're working in conditions that are poor and is going to affect your physical health, then it's still responsibility of your employee. This is occupational health 101. But then how do you control that? In doing that, it's so much harder than if you are providing the infrastructure from HQ. So a lot of unknowns on that. And then, of course, when we ask people, not surprising reasons for going back to the office, not every day, a few days a week, it's to see each other. We miss interacting face-to-face, socializing. So as much as we can do and learn how to do work and do well away from HQ, we're just human beings. We need to interact and see each other and socialize and talk and have that, interaction with people. And I don't think that's going to be it's going to go away anytime soon. This is about it's our needs as humans to be part of this, ecosystem. And then, of course, different levels of seniority, different age groups, you have different needs for this as well. If you have early career researchers, for example, they miss being around senior colleagues just to learn, be trained, and learn doing, the ropes as being in the office. And I think that's the same in a corporate environment. Next slide, the last lesson. I think the pandemic just highlights, and that's what I've been trying to tap into. We need to listen to people. That was already there before the pandemic. This is not new. We need to listen to people. We need to listen to the data. We need to learn from it, and we need to be able to make evidence-based decisions in moving forward. I think data has never been important as it is at the moment, and not only people data, let's say user data, but occupancy data, performance data, indoor quality data. So it's we need to move away from this obsession of just collecting the data, but actually make sense of the data and make decisions with the data that you have in mind, that you have at hand. So this is just one graph to illustrate. These are results from high performance work environments in Australia. 71% of people said that the workspace allows them to interact with people and collaborate with people. This is an open plan office. Just 41% of them said that the workplace allows them to actually perform work without interruptions. And that is always the Achilles heel of open plan offices. That's exactly what you have there. Great for collaboration, maybe not so great for performing work without interruptions. And how you balance that. But then overall, 56% of the same workers said that the workplace has a positive impact on productivity. So if you look at these results individually, they actually tell a very different story about the physical configuration of the space. How much of tweaking the first question or the second question results will influence the productivity, that's where the holy grail comes from, isn't it? What are the tweaks and adjustments that you're going to perform that will actually result in your biggest return of investment? These are all the questions. I could replace productivity with health, and that will be the same challenge. So we're always chasing that. We're trying to figure out how we can better support people in spaces that are going to be high performance, that are going to allow us to work, be satisfied, productive and healthy. Next slide, please. So what are some of the, just bringing to opportunities? I mean, I could talk about more, but two of them. I mean, great opportunity, evidence-based designs. That's what we should be talking about all along. That's what I've been talking about for years now. From a HR perspective, when you're moving offices, and a lot of organizations are now considering that, but even if you're not moving offices, if you're calibrating the workplace or the workforce population that are in HQ and away from HQ at any given time, this is a change. We're going through a massive change. And what we've learned is high performance environments, they always have a structured change management plan. They look after people, they hear people, they have engagement, very high levels of engagement, and they have and provide people with ongoing training and support. So we're going through a massive change. Some organizations are indeed changing. These things are still relevant. They were relevant before, they're relevant now. When it comes to the design of this space, human-centered design approaches that are aligned with the cultural values, multipurpose zone, and freedom for people to interact with the space in a way they can and need and want, they paramount, they super important. When it comes to the key features of spaces, all high-performance workplaces that I ever done research in, they share all of this. They have active design strategies implemented. They have sit-and-stand workstations, end-of-trip facilities, breakout spaces, mobility. They allow people to work, and they have the infrastructure for people to work anywhere. They are mobile workforce. Biophilic design principles, natural textures, access to daylight. All of these physical elements of space are present and shared by all the high-performance workplaces that are ever investigated. Again, I don't think that is going to change. It's just going to become more important. The second opportunity, next slide, please, comes from pushing, new benchmarkings. I think we learn that we have this average. A lot of Australian workplaces perhaps still designed towards this average performance. Of course, we have workplaces that are still underperforming by any sort of measure, and we have these workplaces, usually well-certified workplaces, that are ahead of pack, and they are outperforming the rest. So I think that what the pandemic is really pushing as an acceleration is people will be changing new benchmarkings. I think when it comes to indoor air quality, for example, clearly is not enough to be designing just targeting an average. You actually need to push harder. And that will come with challenges, of course, but this is the thing. As I started the presentation today, workplaces are always changing, and what COVID is a catalyst for change. And this transformation, things that were already on the way, like the appetite for flexibility and the need to change workplaces, it's just going to be accelerated by that. And other perhaps changes that were not so visible, COVID is making the invisible visible, such as indoor air quality related issues. In pushing that harder, I think is definitely on the horizon. Next slide, please. So some of the unknowns, remote working experiences in the long term. I mean, we haven't done it yet. We don't know. We don't even know if we're going to be in lockdown again next year. Depending on where you are at the moment, it may actually be in lockdown. So how to actually maintain, the culture, build trust, create organic incident opportunities for people to learn and innovate. I think we just don't know yet. There are lots of elements of this new way of working that we're experiencing now that I think some managers trying to go back to where we were, while some other managers are having more, more aggressive or adventurous position when it comes to that. But I think it's just we don't know yet. We don't know. We're figuring out as we go, building the flight as it's trying to take off. But we don't know. We've been capturing the short-term kind of experiences or impact and consequences of large-scale uptake of remote working practices, but we don't know the long-term yet. Next slide. Second unknown, what will be this sweet spot for workers in organizations? Of course, there is a lot of friction building in the sense that every time we're out of lockdown that you're supposed to return to HQ, then there is, these different organizations, industry sectors feel differently. So what we're observing here in Australia, and that seems to be consistent around the globe, 2 to 3 days a week at HQ seems what all of us want. We want to retain some control over the other days of the week and work elsewhere, but 2 to 3 days a week, we seem to be okay to be back at HQ. I think from an organizational perspective, there is a need to understand place, role, and team for that specific organization. A lot of organizations are empowering teams with the decision-making of, when they should be together, which days of the week they should be rostering for them to be together. So there is this term that is being coined by Meta 5, is not my managed flexibility, in the sense that you have allocated team days, you have team days set by teams, not the managers, alternate group weeks. So it's a very different way of managing people, thinking about people. I observe a rise of empowering teams, but at the same time, how does the space is going to follow that fluctuation? Comes with a lot of challenges as well, because if you start having completely different occupancy at any given point in time of the week, then of course it comes with challenges. Next unknown. Of course, the purpose of workplace. I think that's the biggest and the most important one that will, either land us in a really happy place or not. Clearly, we need to retain some separation, but we also crave togetherness. So workplaces are very much so, they were before, but very much so now considered as a destination. So the types of activities that you do away from HQ and the types of activities you do at HQ, they're different. It makes no sense to me personally to be going to campus if I'm going to be attending meetings all day, online meetings. So what is the point of being, a HQ and when you're away? These are things that we're still very much trying to figure out, to discuss and agree on. And then, of course, the rise of flexible and reconfigured spaces that I mentioned before to follow this purpose of workplaces, or revised sense of purpose of workplaces. That's a really big question mark in my mind, how these spaces are going to fare against that. Next slide. So if you do have time and you're not too bored or sleeping in Brazil because of the time now, hopefully not, I would like to invite you to answer our remote working survey, contribute to our research, trying to understand the remote working practices where you are. Some of you in Brazil, some of you are not. Thank you so much for the invite, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Chris. For this presentation. Personally, I love when talking about people. That's one of my passions. I like to understand their needs to better build our buildings. So I'm just going to invite Jack to join us again here. I cannot see you both here. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you here. See that?
Okay, good.
Yeah, I can see all of you.
Okay, so we have a few questions here. And I'm going to start with Jack. There's a question for you, Jack. But I believe maybe Chris can also answer, give you your thoughts, Chris. So what kind of policies can be created to regulate the behavior of occupants? And how do occupants react to these policies?
Yeah, it's a great question. Different policies that can regulate the behavior of occupants. One really good example is, and I didn't have time to go through it, but is around if buildings and organizations are providing access to food, having policies around the provision of healthy food. So it's very, what we really try to do is make sure that the healthy choice is the easy choice. It's very easy to, when an organization is providing food and beverages, and there's only an unhealthy option, and people are trying to have something to eat or something to drink, they'll only take the option that is available. But providing them with a healthy option actually makes that significantly easier. So that's one example of how you can provide a policy and put a policy in place that actually nudges behavior of occupants over time. Another one is, and I think that one of the earlier speakers spoke to this, but is having a flexible dress policy. We know that thermal comfort is a source of significant dissatisfaction across our workplaces. Yet, and I'm probably a bad example of this in a jacket and a tie, so don't take me as an example. But having a flexible dress policy is obviously really important to overcome the thermal comfort dissatisfaction across our buildings. It is becoming increasingly uncommon, particularly here in Australia, but I think in other parts of the world, to have a formal dress policy within our organizations. And that isn't just because people feel, it's not just because we're trying to reduce the amount of hierarchy and structure across organizations. It's actually because people feel more comfortable and they feel more thermally comfortable as well. So that's another example of a policy that can influence behavior. I don't know, Chris probably has some additional examples.
No, not really. I would definitely, that nourishment is my favorite concept. I think it's about organizations being control and mindful of what they put into place and make accessible to people. And I think it comes with it's a responsibility. So it's the right choice to start with from where I'm starting, not having unhealthy food within your work premises being offered where you are there. But I think it comes from this place of you're trying to create and promote a culture of health, and which we'll touch upon not only the behavior but the organizational side of things, which is under your control. And by doing that, you're trying to nudge the behavior. And I think that logic is applicable to any single dimension that you would have in terms of healthy workplaces. All the way, as Jack said, from thermal comfort, so you're giving them choice, to health food. Again, you give them a choice of a healthy food. So it's about making that choice easier on your day-to-day basis, but also kind of becoming the natural choice. So in the case of not having tie and jacket, if everyone is there not having tie and jacket, it's just what you do, isn't it? Because that's your behavior becomes your just natural choice. Is not even conscious anymore because we all want to fit in. So you change things that way by perhaps making that the way of working and just the natural way of doing things.
Yeah, so we have a question here. I'm going to address another question for Jack that maybe can follow this discussion. I believe the question was addressed when talking about design strategies. So does this encouragement measures really encourage people to, for example, use the stairs instead of using the lift? So I believe the question is more about not specifically the policies, but like design strategies implemented.
Yeah. It's a really good example, a really good question. I would encourage people to Google 720 Burke Street in Melbourne. It has one of the most amazing internal staircases that I've actually seen anywhere else in the world. And it's in my hometown, so I love it. But it's a beautiful, colourful staircase that goes through the centre of the building. Now, when you walk into the lobby of this particular building, that's where your eyes go to. You see this incredible internal staircase. You don't see the lift or the elevator in the corner of the room. And that's a way that design can actually influence behavior. Whenever, I mean, I know the building very well. I know that the lift is on the right-hand side. But when I bring people from all over the world, whenever they come to Melbourne, I generally, and I encourage anybody who is coming to Melbourne, I would love to take you on a tour of some of our buildings. But whenever I have visitors to Melbourne, I take them on a tour of these high-performing buildings. And whenever we go there, nobody goes to the lift. They all go to the stairs, and we all walk up the building via the stairs. It's a very obvious way that design can influence behavior, and it happens all the time. But you can't have the stairs as a fire staircase that smells, is poorly lit, has horrible acoustics. In many cases, that people feel unsafe. How often have you finished work and you want to take the stairs, but you think to yourself, I don't know if I feel really safe taking those stairs. It's a very common it's a very common experience. So the way that we can design our stairs, it can actually encourage movement across the day. Our modern working lifestyles really encourage sedentary behavior. They don't. Our lifestyles don't encourage movement throughout the day. So the way that we can kind of design our spaces to encourage movement, even if it's as simple as taking the stairs when you arrive to work, is just one additional way that we can have increased movement throughout the day.
Yeah, so we have these design strategies that encourage people like to move or to walk around the building, and I'm just going to follow like another question here. Of course, you both are bringing us like examples from Australia. Do you believe that it can be a cultural thing? We have a question here asking what can be culturally changed in the working environment that could improve occupants' well-being. Of course, it has it's more a specific question, but I also want to address like, you are bringing examples from Australia. Do you believe it is also applied in a different culture?
I
we have a few questions here about it, so I'm just trying to make it one question.
Yeah,
I think good design it's applicable anywhere, everywhere. We all deserve to be in a space that is high performance, and I don't think that is specific to a cultural location or anything. What you can do is to tap into specific cultural aspects to interpret what that high performance, for example, workplace is. In Brazil specifically, the biggest mistake that we're making is to have all the buildings with the climate that we have be fully air conditioned. It makes no sense, none whatsoever, to have air conditioned buildings anywhere. We have a wonderful mild weather throughout. There are places in Brazil that we don't even know what winter is. So why on earth aren't we just going crazy with mixed mode ventilation and mixed mode buildings in Brazil? I cannot believe how we end up being there. So I think, yes, there is a side, perhaps in terms of the building performance, that will be more related to perhaps climate driven aspects. There are other aspects that we consider. The way we dress is very culturally specific. The things that we like, our acoustic preferences. Brazilians are much louder, and we speak with our hands, and it's a different what we tolerate in terms of noise is different. So I think it's learning about what matters, what is relevant and specific for that context. But when it comes to good design, it's good design everywhere. It's irrelevant of where you're going to be working from.
One thing that so I my role takes me to doing work across all of Asia, and we're seeing a lot of focus in developing countries across Asia as well. So the Philippines is a really good example of this. We've seen a huge focus on healthy building design and operations in the Philippines. And one of the reasons for this, and I think every country is slightly different. The reason why healthy buildings has been so strong in Australia is because we're a very competitive group of people. We like to be the best in Australia, and we like to show on the world stage, and that comes out in sport and that kind of thing. We're very, very competitive as a people. That's similar in Singapore. It's you know, in Singapore, the market there is very competitive. They want to, you know, they really want to excel, and there's a lot of kind of business trends that are going on around sustainable investment and investment in social sustainability. In the Philippines, it's more altruistic. The people in the Philippines and the governments in the Philippines, they look at the life expectancy of an average Filipino, and it is significantly lower than Singapore, significantly lower than Malaysia and other parts of Southeast Asia. So for them, they recognize that the built environment has a significant impact on people's health and well-being, and their investment in better building regulations and this focus on healthy buildings is really coming from an altruistic perspective. They want a better lives for their people and for their communities. So I think that the trends are quite different, but as Chris mentioned, this is all, you know, what we mean by a healthy building might change slightly in terms of like in terms of culturally, like what nourishment might mean for people in Japan is quite different to what nourishment might mean for people in the US. But fundamentally, these are interventions that should and could be applied across the world. You know, my lungs in Melbourne are not much different to the lungs of people in other parts of the world. You know, we all deserve good quality air. We all deserve good quality water. Some of the other kind of cultural aspects might be slightly different, but there's a number of interventions or a number of key principles around healthy buildings that should apply across all geographies. And I think that that's something that's really important to recognize.
Yeah, I strongly agree. So I have I believe a very interesting question here. What do you think will not change after this COVID scenario?
Crystal ball time.
I fear that we will go back to traveling the amount that we were traveling pre-COVID, and I'm already starting to see that come back a little bit. I thought that the pandemic would revolutionize the way that we work, in the sense that it would reduce the amount of air travel that we have across the world. I don't know if this is similar in Brazil, but we just, particularly in Australia, particularly across Asia Pacific, we travel a lot. The US is the same. We travel a lot. And it feels like as soon as things started to calm down, unfortunately, people were jumping back on planes and traveling. And I, as somebody who's very passionate about environmental sustainability, I think that we probably travel too much. And I worry that that is something that we haven't learnt as a result of the pandemic.
I agree. I mean, look at that in terms of the way we organize events like this one. We learned so much about and what a busy year we had in having online events, wonderful events that just brought us together in a virtual world, which is actually, you know, a lot easier than it would be if I would have to travel to Brazil to give this presentation, for example. So I agree with Jack in terms of I already seen the events resuming and returning to the old ways of organizing events. And I think that's a big loss, actually, because not all of us can travel all the time. Not all of us want to travel all the time. And when I think back, going to a conference that you go there and you're going to stay for 2 days for the event, but you traveled from Australia 24 hours if you're lucky, usually more, one way in and one way out, and then a couple of days sightseeing is like 1 week of travel to give a 15 minutes presentation. So it's a lot of money and time, and I think there are events that just work. And I don't think I had, of course, in the beginning you would have a thing of a lesser experience, but when it comes to sharing the information and engaging with people, I don't really think that we have a lesser of experience. than we would have if we are on site. Of course, we miss on the human components of socializing and so on and so forth, but sometimes that's a trade-off. Perhaps you can attend more events and just cherry pick the ones that you want to do one-on-one, but not all events should return back to where we were for the same reasons that Jack pointed out.
I also want to kind of mention that this focus on healthy buildings, I think a lot of people think that COVID, and to some degree it's correct, but the pandemic has changed our industry and to focus on healthy buildings. The reality is that this was something that was already happening. COVID and the pandemic has simply accelerated it. We were seeing significant increase in interest in uptake of healthy building practices pre-pandemic. The difference with the pandemic is that suddenly CEOs, CFOs, the C-suite of organizations are asking about healthy buildings. What are we doing to make our buildings more resilient? What are we doing to make our buildings healthier? But I would say that this is something that has not come about as a result of the pandemic. It's just the pandemic has simply accelerated it.
Yeah, I completely agree as well. So I would love to stay here and talk about it throughout the night, but it's a bit late here in Brazil. I want to thank you both for joining us today, for accepting this invitation. It's a really a big pleasure to have you both here. Juliana, are you there? You want to give a few last words?
Yes, I have a few questions too, but probably in another time. I think we will need another sections like this to continue the topic. They're so interesting and so important to us to bring and to share with the people here in Brazil and other countries. So I want to thank you so much, Chris and Jack, to join us today in this section. It's great. I really learn a lot and enjoy our evening. Thank you so much and have a good day to you. You are in the morning, right?
Yeah, you both have a good day. So I just want to thank our audience for taking this time, for making this a priority and joining us during these few hours. And I hope you all have enjoyed as much as I did. Thank you all. Thank you, Jack, Chris. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.